Hi, Victoria.
Hi, Josiah.
How are you?
Great.
Good. You are my youngest guest. So I'm really excited to do this because I was getting feedback from some of my listeners, and they're like, "Hey, it's really interesting to listen to someone in their 70s, but I'm in my teens, 20s, and sometimes it's harder to relate to that."
hmm
And so, you being out of early adulthood, I think it would have been nice to talk to you to get your perspective on what that what that thought process was like being a young adult female and all that good stuff. So that's why I thought of you, and also I was really interested in your profession, and that's something lately I'm becoming more interested in. So what I normally do is we start with, well, you're not that old. So when they're in their 70s, they have a
Relatively.
lot of years to go back. But I like to start just from the beginning, go from childhood, and then from there we'll get to where you are today. Sound good?
hmm
All right, so tell us a little bit about who you are and your name and all that good stuff.
So I'm Victoria. So by who I am, do you mean my profession
Sure.
or any?
Yes.
Okay. So LICSW, licensed independent clinical social worker. And most of the time when people ask me what I do, I say like therapist, clinical therapist. Because social worker, I think they have a different idea of
Yeah, when you said that term to me, I was like, I thought of like,
like charity work.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, so licensed clinical therapist. So I work at a psychiatric hospital. So my work is primarily clinical. I see patients all day long.
So let's go into childhood. So I have a daughter,
hmm
so I find this really important because being a boy, I kind of know how life is for them, but as a girl,
And how old is she now?
I'm a seven.
7. Oh my gosh, I thought
Um,
she was like 4.
no, she's a lot of fun. I love her a lot, but there's a lot I don't know about
hmm
her. So let's go to childhood. What was that like? Your 0 to 10.
I actually have a hard time sometimes with my memory when it comes to my childhood. Um, so I often I'll have to like look at pictures, like photographs to reference memories.
Mm-hmm.
Um, 0 to 10. I remember we grew up in Springwood. Do you know where Springwood is?
Washington?
Yeah, in
No.
Kent.
Oh,
It's
Kent. I know
it
Kent.
was like an immigrant community basically. I remember we had a social worker who
Were you born in America?
I was actually, yeah, all my siblings too. My mom was pregnant with me on the way over here from Belarus. Um, so I remember we grew up with a lot of our cousins. They were all living there. They're now kind of spread out all over the United States. But I remember my mom going with me to Head Start, like have you heard of Head Start?
Mm.
So I remember they had me go to Head Start and my sister to learn English. And so
Mm-hmm.
my mom would come with me as a volunteer to also learn English alongside me. And
So you grew up speaking Russian like
first,
at a
yeah,
young age?
Russian first. Yeah, because my parents, that's all they spoke.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember they would watch TV to try to learn the language, the English language. And so, yeah, my mom would go with me, which was really fun. And then I remember, so we finally moved. My parents saved up money for a house. We moved to Puyallup. And at the time, we were probably the only Slavic family there. And I remember already, I was in second grade, so 7 or 8 years old, already being nervous about the fact that I'm Russian or that I have a Russian last name and
Mm-hmm.
kind of being embarrassed by that
Mm-hmm.
because people would be like, I can't pronounce your name. Why is it so long?
Mm-hmm.
And and a lot of my neighborhood friends who found out that we were Slavic were like, "Oh, are your apples from Russia? Is everything you eat from Russia?"
Would you say you got bullied or more just questioned?
I wouldn't say, no, it wasn't
Just
bully. It
more
was more so
curious.
question. Yeah, curiosity. I think there is a piece. I think sometimes kids can be very mean, like
Mm-hmm.
pretty vicious sometimes. Um, so it's more like, oh, you're different. Like I didn't necessarily look different. But I remember kind of being hesitant about having friends over sometimes because of like, oh, is my mom going to make the stereotypical beet soup, or what are we going to eat, or how are they going to act? Are they going to be used to this? Like, are my friends going to be used to this?
Yeah.
So trying to kind of blend in a little bit more with them.
Mm-hmm. And then you had siblings?
Yeah, 3 siblings, so 2 younger sisters and the brother who's the baby.
Okay. So, uh, what was life like once you got into early teens?
Mm. I remember, let's see. I remember being pretty involved at church. And that's actually another thing I forgot to mention. We grew up very like religious, and it's different than just saying like Christian. And you know this, like Slavic Christian is different than like an American church, for example. I remember finding out, like being surprised at a young age, probably again like first or second grade, finding out that there are Americans, like English speaking people that believe in God, and like what, they go to church too, because we had such a like close knit Slavic community. Everyone there spoke Russian, and so anyway, I remember kind of getting out of that, exploring more like American churches growing up. I remember really caring a lot about school. Like I really enjoyed school, but I just remember putting a lot of emphasis on that. In hindsight, I think a little bit too much on like making sure I always did my homework.
So for a girl that's maybe similar to that, what would you say then? Because everyone knows that kid that puts a lot of effort into school. How would you say that was not great or detrimental?
It's not that I was very like goal oriented on making sure. I was like, I want to go to college because my family, nobody in my family went to college, and my dad, a lot of our cousins are nurses, so he's like, you should just be a nurse. And that's pretty stereotypical too, I think, in our culture. And I was just like, no, I took some nursing classes and I was like, I hate this. It's so boring to me. But I really liked psychology. So going back to your question, do I think it's bad? No, I enjoyed school so much. So it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but I started my master's program at age 19, and like looking back, it's like I never really took a break. And
We're gonna get to that part.
okay.
You're saying even from like early teens, you enjoyed school, you put a lot of time and effort into it.
Yeah, but sometimes it felt like a little bit too much emphasis was put on that over anything else
So
in my
that was
life.
self-driven, not necessarily from your parents.
Well, they definitely had expectations of me. Like if you look at birth order, and a lot of times the first child is kind of like the golden child, meaning that the parents have really high, unrealistic expectations of them. And that definitely was me. I remember if I got like a B in class or for an assignment, I would definitely get in trouble for it. But then with my sisters and my brother, they never got in trouble. Like my parents were happy that my brother just like passed school, passed every year. So that always
So there
felt
was stress
unfair.
from the parents as well. But at least you enjoyed school.
I did, yeah.
So teenage years, you knew you wanted to go into, you already kind of had an idea, go to college, get a degree in psychology.
I didn't know necessarily that I was going to get a degree in psychology. I did Running Start, so I think it was like 16, 17 when I did that. And I just remember like one of the prerequisites was Psych 101. And I took it and I just immediately fell in love with it because I was so fascinated by, and I think this is why nursing, and again, nursing isn't boring by any means, but for me, I was like, I'm just not interested in that. I liked that in psychology, you're kind of working with the invisible, like the mind. There's not necessarily.
So here's what's super interesting about that. I took psychology my senior year. I hated it.
Really? Oh, well, actually, that doesn't surprise me because we talked about this like 5 years ago.
And I remember sitting there in class and I'm just like, they're just telling you how to be a human. And again, this was my mindset back then. And I just remember being like, why do I need to read a book that tells me to be a human? Now, obviously, 16, 17 years later, it's like, oh, the people who understand that, the people who understand how the mind works and the brain and emotions, they can use it for two things or multiple things, but they can use it for good and use it for bad, right? To manipulate, to sell. And so, yeah, people who understand that stuff earlier in life are then able to use it to their advantage. Like, I'm sure you've heard of Robert Greene.
I'm terrible with names.
So he's the one that wrote 48 Powers of Law, or you haven't heard of this guy? Maybe he's more in the man world. So like he even wrote a book with 50 Cent, but he's like this white dude that basically you can read this book and it tells you a lot about human psychology and how to So when he wrote 48 Hours of Law, it was pretty controversial because
Mhm.
it was like basically he would tell a real story that happened in recent history, past few hundred years, and be like, in this situation, see how this person manipulated this person to
Mhm.
get this right. And he's like, the reason why I wrote that was there's always people out there that are going to want to manipulate,
Mhm.
and then there are always people that are going to be manipulated. This book
Right.
was written for the people not to tell you how to manipulate, but how someone's trying to manipulate.
Mhm.
So that's why you read it, because people read it and like, man, this is terrible stuff, and he's like, no, that's just how life works,
Mhm.
right? So you
Human
want to
nature.
understand how someone's going to try to use you. But I didn't understand this stuff when I was 17 when I took the
Mhm.
class. But it's just funny. Me and you took the same class.
Had
You
very
loved
different
it. I'm just
responses.
like, what is going on? This is just. I remember just sitting there reading it. I'm just like, this is silly.
Yeah, no, I was so fascinated by it. And I remember, I think a part of me was like, I need to figure out what I'm going to do with my life at age 17, or at least, so actually Jessica Gavronsky went with me. We did Running Start together.
Mhm.
And
So you
uh,
guys went to high school together. That's how you knew each
that's
other.
how we met. Yeah.
Mm.
We had all our classes together, and at lunch we're like, well, I guess we should just be friends then.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, so we did Running Start. And I remember kind of like feeling, so again, my family wasn't necessarily like, you need to go to college. They, that wasn't necessarily on their radar. My dad was like, you don't even need to go to college. And my mom told me recently, and it was surprising to hear her say this to me. She said, you were so focused and motivated on getting into college. And because when I think about how I used to be, I almost think of myself as a kind of a meek person. Like I used to, like I was just, I don't know if I'd describe myself as like quiet necessarily, but again, like the kind of struggled with perfectionism and always having to appear like everything was okay. Like, so compared to like Diana, my sister, who was much more rebellious than I was.
Hmm.
And now it's like, oh, I like a lot of those traits that she has because she's very driven as well and won't like let my parents dictate her life. Whereas I definitely let at least my dad, or what I thought he expected of me, to dictate my life for quite a while.
So here's what's interesting. I had a recent encounter with my boys. They play
Hmm.
basketball, and I feel like I don't put expectations on them. But there was the time when they're like playing game, and after the game we're talking, and they'll talk to their mom about whatever, and Luke is saying, "Well, Dad, this is how Dad is going to think about this situation,"
Hmm.
and so they self-imposed what they thought I wanted, and I've never been like, "You have to be really good at basketball." So it's interesting that the child does it themselves,
Hmm.
even though I've never been like, "Hey, you need to be better, right? Or you need to do this, you need to
Maybe
do
not
that."
in those words, but I wonder sometimes if we model that stuff in other
Yeah,
ways,
so I
right?
thought about that because it's like, because like we all hear those stories of, oh, my parents expected this and I could
Hmm.
never, I know that, but it's like I try to be the parent where I don't do that, but
Hmm.
even when I feel like I'm
Yeah.
not, he still thinks I want that, and I'm
Hmm.
just like, dude, I'm not even telling you to do that, but
Yeah.
maybe I am, right? That's the
Or he
whole,
just wants to impress his dad.
yeah.
Mm.
So it's like I feel like I'm not, but it's possible that I am, just not doing it as obvious.
Hmm.
But it was funny for them to have that. It was interesting to hear them say that to their mom, like, Dad will think this if I do that. And it's like, dude, I just want you to have fun.
Yeah.
Like, that's
Yeah.
literally the whole reason of doing basketball was just so you could have fun.
Hmm.
It didn't really
Not to
matter.
excel.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's funny because I feel like he self-imposed what he thought I
Hmm.
wanted on him.
Hmm.
So it seems to be more innate than just sometimes you have the overbearing parent, right?
Hmm.
But in this situation, I think it was like part of that's innate to
And you
wanting to
found
please.
out because they told their mom?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um. So late teens, uh, was marriage a thing that you were interested in, or you were like, I want to get married, or what was that all about?
That's another example of where I was such a goody goody that my dad, like, when we were young, said, you can't have a boyfriend. And because I wanted to be super trustworthy and honest and obedient, I remember like, I had a crush on the quarterback in high school. And he had a crush on me, asked me to be his girlfriend. And I said no because my dad didn't let me have a boyfriend. I was 17 at the time, I believe. And So dating, I think I went straight from like no boyfriend. Like, yes, there were crushes, mutual crushes and things like that. But I also, my dad would say things like, you know, you need to marry someone within the Russian, like within the Slavic culture. And I would take it as like such a command, like I have to do this. And on some level, even if I didn't want to, and I remember thinking, oh, I don't know if I want to marry someone. We used to call them, and I know this is not PC, like fresh off the boat or
Yeah, yeah,
fobs, like someone super Slavic. I didn't want to marry someone like that because I'm just like, okay, that doesn't necessarily, I feel different having grown up here. I feel like I've had a different life, and I was like, I want someone more Americanized. And so when my ex came along, I was 16 when I met him, and I just remember thinking, oh, he's like an Americanized Slavic guy, so my parents would approve.
yeah.
And yeah, so we started dating. My mom said a while later that she was surprised that we were going to date for so long. She thought he was just going to be my first boyfriend, and then I'm going to be done with it. And
How much older was he?
he was 18, so we were 2 years apart.
Okay, so not that. I thought your age gap was bigger than
Oh
that.
no, yeah, but maybe 2.5 years
Hmm.
apart. And I don't even know where to start with this, but like who I look at, the traits that I look at now in a man or in a significant other are so different.
Did you even know what to look for back then?
No, actually, what I always wanted was someone nicer than my dad. Um, my dad has zero emotional regulation skills, and again, stereotypically will show anger all the time, and that's maybe one of the only emotions he feels comfortable expressing.
Hmm.
And so I kept thinking, okay, I just want to marry someone nicer. And what's interesting now is that actually the person that I married, now my ex, had a lot of similar traits to my father. He didn't yell necessarily,
Hmm.
but there were so many similarities, and it's because, and now I realize that I was just kind of repeating the pattern that I saw in my life in terms of relationships. So my parents' relationship was always tumultuous. They're no longer married now, or they're kind of in the process of divorce, but are living separately.
Hmm.
And it was always a struggle. Like and I don't say this lightly, I'm not exaggerating. I don't think I've ever seen my parents make an agreement or a decision together. Like they've never been on the same team. It was always like two people against each other. And
Yeah, when you have that
yeah.
as a model, so I did a podcast with a marriage counselor earlier,
Mhm.
and he says one of the first questions he asked was, "Are you happy with the way your parents were married, or did they get divorced?"
Mhm.
And usually, if they were divorced, he's like, "How is your marriage going to be different?"
Yeah.
And they're like, "I don't know." He's like, "Well, it's
Mhm.
going to end up the same
Yeah.
way because
Yeah.
that's what was modeled after you."
Mhm.
And yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, you forget a lot of your childhood, and I do too. But it forms who you become.
Mhm.
You forget most of it,
Yeah.
but because they talk about like age 2 to 3, this development, age 3 to 4, and then you're like, it's so crucial. But then you consciously forget a lot of the things that
Mhm.
made you who you are,
Yeah.
um, which is then, yeah, it's just thinking about the person that you become. But then later on, you have all these self-limiting beliefs
Mhm.
that you then have to break away from to become a different type
Yeah.
of person.
Yeah.
Um, so did you want to get married at a young age? Was that a desire, or that just because in that culture it was like just
Mhm.
get married, I
I
guess?
I did tell my mom I'm never getting married before the age of 21. And I got married at 21 because it was pretty common to get married 18, 19, 20, like late teens, early
Yeah.
20s. I remember my grandma mentioning to my cousin who's getting married at age 23 that she's like old for a bride because that was just not the norm. Like the norm was to get married very young. So I felt kind of rebellious telling my mom, I'm not going to and she was never pushy about marriage either. Um, but I was just like, I'm never going to get married before I'm 21. And so looking back, I don't like that. Like I think about how I applied for like UW School of Social Work because it was in Washington State. Looking back, I'm like, there was actually a school and program in New York that I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Um, So I think it was limiting in that way. So anyway, I know I'm kind of going on
No,
a
that's fine.
tangent, but I didn't want to necessarily be married early, but we had met at 16, and I'm pretty sure you know our story. Again, going back to like that very black and white thinking I had, like the all or nothing thinking with being a goody goody. We literally did not even kiss before we got married. So 5 years of that, no like physical touch, nothing.
So would you say that maybe that wasn't beneficial, that part?
Not at all. I would never do that again.
So
I
if you
thought,
would, your daughter, well, we can get into this if you want. So
mhm.
if you have a daughter, well, I guess how would you do things differently? What
So,
boundaries would you want for your daughter?
well, I think even just looking back for myself, I thought like that was such a good boundary to have. And without like getting into too much detail, I just realized like we didn't have a lot of emotional or physical depth to us.
So what attracted you to him?
That's a great question.
I
You know,
ask this because
let me try to
I
remember.
I find a
Yeah.
lot of girls. Again, I'm not in that world anymore. I'm married, happily married, so I don't have to worry about
Right.
dating. But I do think a lot of girls marry not so great guys more often than not.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I'm always wondering why. Because I feel like if you're definitely if you're attractive, you should have options.
Hmm.
If you're somewhat attractive, you should have options. So then why do these attractive girls end up settling for a loser?
And I remember when we were talking on the phone, you were like, and it was funny, you said, did you not get any attention before Max, or did you not have any attention before your ex came along? And the interesting thing was like, no, I had attention. Like I got
Yeah.
attention from
Did you know
males.
you were pretty
Um,
and you just didn't use like some girls they'll use that to manipulate
I don't
females.
use, I have no, I'm not like that savvy enough to feel like I could ever use that. However, it would go back and forth. Like I would hear people telling me I'm pretty, but then growing up in the environment that I did, there was a lot of insecurity. And I remember my mom even just because there's three daughters, and she's like, "Oh, my daughters are so beautiful." And I still remember it very clearly. My dad said to her, like, "Don't compliment them. It's gonna like make their head big." You know, what's that expression? I'm really bad with
Yeah.
expressions, but
Yeah, I mean I think my daughter's very she's gorgeous. And we
mhm.
tell her that every day. And I have no qualms about that, but I think women deal with beauty differently than men
Mhm.
do. So that's something I'm trying to understand a little bit more. But for you, I'm curious what your mindset like. Obviously, you had some idea that you were prettier than the average girl, but it didn't seem to.
Yeah, I'm not like, oh, I'm ugly. I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
gonna pretend. But there were, yeah, it depends. It depends on the context I'm in, like whether, like what social context I'm in. Like sometimes I do remember being so, and I don't like to say this, like I'm not saying it like, oh, pity me or anything like that, but I just remember sometimes being surprised when people said that I was pretty, but then finally getting to a point where I'm like, okay, where do these insecurities stem from? Um, Shoot, I lost my train of thought.
yeah. And I think, and that's why um, your parent, like, if you have a really good relationship with your father, he can
Mhm.
help in that area,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
And when
Yeah.
you don't, it's like, ooh, that's tough, right?
Hmm.
So, like, for me, with my daughter, I want her to know that I love her for who she is,
Hmm.
right? And I think, I don't know if you got that from your dad.
If I had to
Did he
give a
ever,
yes or no,
yeah,
no.
did he ever tell you he loved you?
Every now and then, my family isn't big on words of
Right.
affirmation.
Did you feel loved growing up by him?
No.
Would you go, this is like, would you go up to him and run to him and hug him and kiss him and tell him you loved him? Do you remember?
I was always scared of him. I was always afraid of him. And um, the the tone of our home was completely dependent on my dad's mood. And
Mm.
so it was very unpredictable, kind of like walking on eggshells, not knowing is he going to be really pissed off when he gets home from work. And so I just remember learning to be really quiet, very obedient, And again, this is where at the time I didn't understand my sister, who was 1 year younger than me, 1 year and 4 months younger than me. She would rebel or like get in trouble and would get in a ton of trouble.
Did your parents do corporate punishment on you?
What do you mean?
Were you all got in trouble if one of you was in trouble, or they just?
With me, just with me. I got in trouble if I didn't take care of the younger kids. So if one of them got in trouble, it was always my
Yeah,
responsibility.
that's not good.
It wasn't great. And I actually had a conversation with my mom about that a couple years ago that I was, because in some ways they still kind of expected that from me. And I was just like, I'm sick of that. Like, that's too much responsibility. Like, I
Yeah,
don't need that.
because we have a conversation like that at our home. It's like, hey, if one of the kids in trouble, they don't all need to be in trouble. Because in the military, it's very corporate
Yeah.
punishment, and that's military. Like
hmm
someone could die, right? But in a household
Yeah, there's
family,
a reason for that structure.
yeah, in a household, it's like, okay, if one of the kid messes up, not all four have
hmm
to suffer. Um, but yeah, like with my daughter, she comes up to me, we hug, I
hmm
put her to bed, lots of love,
hmm
and she knows that and she feels that, and I hope that continues until, I mean, forever,
Yeah.
but definitely until another man comes into her life.
hmm
But yeah, I don't. Girls that don't have a strong father, I think, can have difficult relationships with other men,
Yeah.
boys.
Well, and people call it like daddy issues, like in a negative way, but honestly, both females and males can often have, issues with their parents, with their father.
Yeah,
Um, so that was, yeah, kind of my way of showing it. It wasn't like there were stereotypical ways to, I think, show that, and people be like, oh, she has daddy issues, things like that. But I just remember, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, always being really scared of him. And we actually we don't talk right now. Like I ended up just discontinuing, like blocking him on my phone for the last year or so. And that was interesting. So actually, okay, well, I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself, but I was going to talk about when I started going to therapy, but then,
we're gonna get to that. Let's put a bow on your dad for a second. But I did
mhm,
have this question. Maybe you don't know the answer. Maybe it's just that culture that he came from because he wasn't loved.
mhm.
Well, why do you think he was the man he was?
I absolutely think he had a very traumatic childhood. And it was all about, like, they were pretty impoverished. So it was all about, like, staying alive. And so I don't think he got love and affection from his parents. Or I think he did from my grandpa. My grandpa, everyone who knows him said he was the kindest man ever. And I did experience that with him. He was just so loving and giving and very calm. Whereas my grandma was the opposite of that. And so I hear my dad every now and then, if he is complaining about his childhood, it would be like, I feel like he has a lot of resentment towards my grandma and the way that she raised him and the rest of the siblings. So I absolutely recognize that it stems from somewhere. And it's generational trauma that continues
Yeah.
to be passed down unless you recognize it.
Yeah, and then we're going to talk a lot about therapy later, but at some point, someone has to break that cycle.
hmm
And because it's like, yes, you aren't. So there's a guy I met, he's 40, was into drugs. So it's like, hey, dude, that's your fault. But then it's like, well, his mom exposed him to drugs
hmm
when he was a teenager. At 13, his mom went to jail. So
Yeah.
then it's like, all right, he grew up in that environment, so that you can't fault him for that necessarily,
So
right?
yeah, it's not as simple as,
Right. So having that conversation with
Mhm.
him definitely gave me a lot more sympathy for that. But then at some point, you do have to take
Mhm.
responsibility, no matter how you were raised,
Right,
right? So
right.
I would put it on him like, hey man, like, yes, that sucked. You went through that trauma,
And now it's
but
time.
that doesn't give you the right to continue that negative behavior. But and that's probably what you do when you go to therapy. But it's like, yeah, here's the thing about, like, I'm gonna do the best I can with my kids, right?
hmm
They're gonna turn 18 and be like, yeah, man, you sucked. And I'll be like, dude, I did the best I could, because it's like,
Right.
no matter what you
They're like, as
do,
long as I'm doing better than what I had growing
yeah.
up.
And so I don't know if you can be the best perfect parent. Obviously, you do the best you can, but
hmm
sometimes the best you can isn't good enough.
Yeah.
That's why you need professional and all that.
hmm
But it will be interesting to see what my kids say once they're like adults, because
hmm
we think we're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah.
But then they'll be like, well, remember this one time? Like, yeah, so that'll be funny to see what that will be like.
I know sometimes I'll bring stuff up with my mom and she's like, oh my gosh, how do you remember that? Like I remember really quick, because again, we grew up in a not so great neighborhood community, and I got like for free, there was this thing called Charlie and Friends. They would give out Christmas presents to the neighbors. And I got a Barbie, and someone, like my uncle had told my mom, oh, you can make money off of that and like return that Barbie and get $25. And so my mom was like, okay, I'll let them keep one of the Barbies, my sister's Barbie, but probably because I was older, she returned my she had skates and everything. It was so cool. She returned my Barbie for $25. And to this day, I still remember that, how heartbroken I was
Yeah.
that she did that. And she's heartbroken now because she's just shocked that I still remember that. And I was like, that was such an important moment.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's usually like the little things that will have like
Yeah,
the lasting impact.
absolutely.
And so now I'm like, as a parent, like, okay, what little things have I done to my child? But yeah,
Well, I think the fact that you're even cognizant of that is saying a lot. I think, again, because I think a lot of us, like with my dad and with me for a long time, I was just living on autopilot. I wasn't reflecting at all on my patterns. Like, why did I marry the person that I married? I remember getting a glimpse into it's like maybe right after, or at some point, early point in my marriage, I remember telling one of my friends, it's so interesting. It seems like healthy people tend to marry healthy people, and then people from dysfunctional families are like more comfortable marrying someone else with a dysfunctional family. It's not like such a red flag.
yeah.
And that was the very, very beginning of me recognizing like what that even meant. And I mentioned earlier like how it really shifted the way, like what traits and qualities I look for in a person now compared to a decade ago.
Yeah. Well, even on the drive here, I was talking to my niece, and uh, she's like, I just want to get married. And I'm like, cool. What do you look for? He loves God. Cool. So does every other Christian
And
guy.
what does that mean? Yeah, what does that look like?
So let's keep unpacking that. So she listed like 4 different things. There's like 4 P's. And I was like, that's really cool. I'm glad you have that because I don't even think most people even have that. They're just like, he's attractive, I'm
Yeah.
attractive. I think we can figure this out. And so it's like, no, I have actually
As
have a
long as
game.
we love each other enough,
Yeah.
we can make it work.
Yeah, which is not a very good game plan. So let's go back to 18-year-old. You had a boyfriend. Did you have so like some boys want to become millionaires, or they have these big dreams, big aspirations. Did you have that mindset when you were young to be extremely wealthy? Did you have like some crazy dream or was it just or were you just thinking about the next year? You weren't necessarily thinking 10, 20, 30 years
I
down the road.
think for the most part, I was thinking just like next year, like I just got to get through school. I need to finish my bachelor's, get my master's. And I do remember thinking like I want to be financially well off. I wouldn't say that I was just like, oh, I need to become a millionaire. But that was definitely something on my mind. And I think that's another thing, culturally speaking, that is something people in my culture value. And like you know, even if you don't have any money, you're gonna look really good. You're gonna have a nice, like my mom always said, like, yeah, even if we're going to the grocery store, we're gonna look really nice. And, you know, at the time they used to wear heels to the grocery store, you always had to look really good. So there is that almost superficial aspect to it. Like everything has to look good on the surface. So I don't know that I was necessarily thinking 10, 20, 30 years ahead, but that was somewhat important. And I will say with my ex, that was like the most important thing to him. I think I realized like wanting to not necessarily become a millionaire, but make something of himself. And so that's why he had his idea, his patent. And looking back, I remember being really upset because almost the entire marriage, like 6 of the 7 years, maybe even longer, were really all about his invention and making something out of it. And a lot of times I would say, can you just get a job, please? Like anything, I don't care what you do. I just need some help with the finances. Like I can't be the breadwinner. Right now, it's just not working. And I remember my job was so stressful at the time that I was willing to go somewhere else and make less money because it was such a hard job. I was barely getting by day by day.
Yeah, let's talk. I want to actually talk about that when you get to
Okay.
that phase. Um, so money, kind of, but not like we're a lot of guys. I want to be a millionaire by the time I'm 25. It's just no, I just want to be financially well off because it leads possibly to higher quality of life or
Yeah.
something. So you're in college now. You have the boyfriend, but you're really just focused on. At least you knew you wanted to get this degree in.
hmm
Why did you know about the whole social work, what you could do with the degree, or you just knew you wanted to get the degree? Because some people just,
I,
I'm just gonna get the
mhm.
degree, but then after the fact, they don't know what they're gonna do with it. Did
Yeah.
you know the next step after that?
I remember at first I took again, Psych 101. I just liked the class so much that I thought to myself, I'm going to keep taking classes and see where it takes me. And so then I realized, okay, I'm going to transfer after I got my AA at Pierce College. I decided, okay, I'm going to get my bachelor's in psychology at a university. And while I was at the university, are we allowed to say where
Yeah, it's
I
fine.
went to school? Northwest University. I remember wanting to go to Northwest because it was a small school, and I had known some people who had gone there. But anyway, one of my professors, he told me, I didn't even know that, again, I had a similar, I guess, misconception of what social work was. Like you mentioned, a lot of people do now. I didn't know you could be a therapist with a social work degree.
Hmm.
And my professor said, if you get into UW School of Social Work, like forget even going to our master's program. He's like, please go here. It's a like renowned school. And you could, and he's the one who told me you could do anything with a social work degree, anything meaning like anything that a therapist can do and more, like a licensed mental health, LMHC.
So that's we're gonna get into what all that because
Mhm.
that's I start when I was researching our shot, I was like, is there like a big term and then there's subcategories under that? Well, let's talk about that later. So he was telling you, hey, go. Did you have a desire to help people at that point in your life?
Yeah. I think about that all the time now. I was always drawn to the helping field. And if I really want to reflect why, a lot of the time I remember thinking it was selfish to do anything else. Like if I wanted to get into marketing or design or something like that, I think a part of me was like, that wouldn't look good because I wouldn't seem like a good person. Um, so, so I do really enjoy working with people, helping people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think there were many layers to why I
Yeah.
pursued that.
So you finished with your bachelor's and then you got accepted to UW
hmm
and their master's.
hmm
And so you knew once you got that degree you were going to uh, go work with patients, right? And that was your goal.
Yeah, I think my idea at the time was to do private practice, which I've actually never done. But I thought, one-on-one counseling with someone, that's what I want to do. And then my second year internship in my master's program was at the hospital that I work at now. I've been there for quite a while, I think going on 13, 14 years. Um, and I also at one point thought I would only want to work with kids because, I was like, oh, kids are adorable. And I think I just
They're
felt, I know, well, they are and they're not. But I think I realized again that because I got my master's quite young, I remember just being intimidated or maybe like adults aren't going to take me seriously in this role. So it felt safer to work with kids. But in that internship, I realized very quickly, oh, I love working with adults. And I stayed working with adults for the most part ever since.
not. So let's get. So I'm curious. You're going through this material that's psychology and therapy. At that point, did you ever think you needed it in your life?
I think a lot of people get into the field, maybe not on a conscious
Yeah.
level, but they're fascinated for it or by it for a reason.
Hmm.
And I don't think I ever, again, I was kind of on autopilot, never really taking the time to truly reflect on my own life
Yeah, that's what I was
and
getting
my
at.
patterns. And so I think like it felt safe to to learn more about psychology in that career, but focus on someone else, not really look inward, look at myself. So it wasn't until I got divorced that my former boss, she was like, you need to go to therapy, because she knew how difficult of a transition of a time in my life it was. And she had gone through a divorce as well. And she just said, I don't think you realize how much of an impact this is having on you and will have on you. Like, it's okay to go to therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking for a while, well, what would I learn? Like, am I going to learn anything new? I am a therapist.
Right.
But I think even that was a way to not really deal with my own stuff. It was a way to kind of feel safe in ignorance,
So
basically.
let's get into that.
Mhm.
We're jumping a little ahead, but
Mhm.
that topic of you're an expert in that field, right? But just talking through it with someone, when you're sitting there in those sessions, are you like, oh, I know what they're gonna ask me, but just verbally saying it was helpful, or
Wait, what do you mean? Can you rephrase that?
so you're already a therapist. You're
Mhm.
sitting with a therapist. You know the
I see.
games they're gonna play,
Hmm.
but you just have to be open to that and be like,
Yeah.
hey, I want to go through the motions because that there's the value. Or did they actually introduce a new idea or concept to you that you hadn't known or thought about?
It's not that there were new ideas introduced, it was just that I was actually able to apply them, because it's easy to teach it or talk about it to somebody else who has to do all the work.
Right.
But now I'm the one who's faced with doing the work. And one thing that I tell people that are curious about therapy or that are really against therapy, I just tell them how much work it really is. Like, it's much harder. As a therapist, it can be really hard work. But being the client or the patient is much harder, because again, to have to apply that, to have to really look at yourself. And that's what I found beneficial, is that therapists would uncover a lot of my blind spots that I can't be objective about
Mm-hmm.
with myself. And I do remember after like 6 months of seeing this therapist, I had said something about my family, and she said, finally, you're being, like, not necessarily honest. It's not like I was being deceitful, but she said, you're letting me know that your family's not perfect. Because when they ask about your childhood, I guess I minimized a lot of the stuff that really happened.
Right.
Um,
And that's like, as I've been listening to John Deloney more, he forces, and he has to do things so quickly, right?
mhm.
Because he's trying to give you help in like 10, 15
Mhm.
minutes. So part of it is he's forced to, but he's just like, no, tell me, you have to actually say how bad it is.
Yeah.
And they're like, I was blah, blah, blah. And he's like, yes, just say it.
Mhm.
Just by saying it is almost therapeutic in and of
Yeah,
itself.
absolutely.
Because we do, when we've experienced trauma, we want to minimize it.
Mhm.
Because then it's like, oh, that happened to me. So yeah, I've definitely been learning a lot from him.
Yeah.
For someone that's never been to therapy, it's like, oh, it's probably pretty good.
Yeah, like I said earlier too, off camera, I really truly believe that every human being should go to therapy. Not necessarily like ongoing life for your lifetime, but I just think we all have some sort of trauma or unresolved issue that's still maybe potentially negatively impacting our life. And
So do you, now at your age, practice self-therapy? And I can define that if you want.
so, yeah, do you mean like reading self-help
No.
books?
Self-therapy. So, um, self-therapy is knowing the tools
Hmm.
and then just practicing yourself.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, this is again, I could be totally wrong and I want you to correct me, but like, again, it's hard to see blind spots.
Hmm.
But one way to practice seeing those blind spots is what they call reframing the situation.
Hmm.
And so there's a guy, Alex Ramosi, he hates therapists. He's like, I've been to all of them, they all suck.
Hmm.
But it's funny.
He sounds like the common denominator here.
But he practiced a lot of self-therapy. So it's like, dude, you rag on all these people,
Yeah.
but in reality, you practice therapy. You just have the awareness, because that's, I think, part of it is awareness, to be actually honest with yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most people aren't honest with themselves. And once you have the ability to be honest with yourself, then you can practice self-therapy by taking that situation. And so that's what he does. Because he's like, he's like, I hate having to go to someone, explain to them my situation, and then that takes all this time. And then by the time we get to it, I could have just done it myself.
Okay, yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, it is an
I'm not saying I
investment.
agree with
No,
that.
I know. I'm saying it is an investment to, it is hard to have to go to
Yeah.
therapy, but he sounds like,
And but then it's like, dude, you just practice self-therapy because most people don't actually sit down and write for hours
hmm
thinking through their thoughts because starting this podcast makes me think a lot more deeply about
yeah,
life, where most people don't do that. They
they
don't
can
actually,
just flow
yeah, they don't think
through life.
through
Yeah.
situations. They just live through the situation
hmm
without thinking. Um, so, but yeah, therapy essentially is sitting down and is it at its core helping reframe the situation you're in, or that's just a tool of many tools?
It's a tool, and that is actually something that I try to do. Like you said, if I'm willing to be brutally honest with myself, like sometimes I'm like, oh, why did I say that? Or why am I acting like that? Am I jealous or envious of someone right now? Or a lot of times a pattern I used to have in like romantic relationships is if I was embarrassed or ashamed, instead of calling out those, naming those emotions for what they were and feeling them, it was much easier to lash out in anger. Like
Yeah.
that was kind of covering up my emotions. I am an overthinker though too, so sometimes that's not helpful either. Sometimes the coping tool at the moment is to not think, not to be so aware of my thoughts. So just, have you
Yeah.
heard of like the 5 4 3 2 1, paying attention to your five senses?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's this. I think in life there's a spectrum on, um, like we're such a unique diversity of human beings and people that one thing may not work for you but work for someone else.
Right.
So I would definitely say that there's not just a one-all sketch
Mm,
solution, right?
absolutely not. Yeah.
But then I have a lot of respect for Jordan Peterson, who's all about therapy,
hmm
right? That's literally how he made a name for himself. And then you have guys like Matt Walsh that are like, you know these guys?
That sounds familiar. Again, I'm so bad with remembering like pop culture.
Um, so Matt Walsh is pretty anti-therapy. So they both work at the Daily Wire.
hmm
And so they actually recently had a podcast where like Matt Walsh is like, therapy's dumb
With,
with Jordan
okay.
Peterson.
hmm
So Jordan Peterson, who literally is
hmm
whether you like the guy or not, he's good at what he does.
Right. Right.
And Matt Walsh is like, so they talked about all that, and um, some things like Matt Walsh would be like, some things you don't need therapy for.
hmm
That's just you like. He's like, this actor had to go to therapy because his movie didn't do well. Boo hoo! Like, why do you need therapy for that, right? But yeah, so it's interesting. I'm definitely not against it. I think
hmm
people should go do it. It's
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah.
But I am curious. What are common issues the patients that come to you, the clients, are they patients or clients?
We call them patients because
Yeah,
it's hospital.
the patients that come to you. What are common issues that you're finding, or is it like pretty random, or are you
So,
seeing common themes or issues or
yes, and yes. So because I work at a psychiatric hospital, we do see,
what does that mean?
um, so not a medical hospital. They're only there for, because they are there for suicidal thoughts, homicidal thoughts, or they're like harmful to themselves or others. Wow, I'm forgetting all my words. Or they're experiencing like psychosis and they're not able to
What is
care,
psychosis?
like they're not able to care. Psychosis meaning, so schizophrenia,
What is that?
schizophrenia in itself isn't necessarily going to hospitalize you. Well, it's a thought disorder.
What is that? I'm serious. You use terms, but I'm not in that world.
You're right. A thought disorder. So,
Because
uh,
I think some people are with the medical world, they use all these
you're
terms,
right.
they
And
don't
it's
actually
like,
know what
it's
the
my
meaning is.
normal, it's like
Yeah,
my language now,
yeah.
but it's not
To
common.
the average person, they're like, "What is psychology? What
Mhm.
is psychiatry?
Right.
What is?" But so
So schizophrenia, so like stereotypically, hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, having delusional thinking.
mhm.
I was waiting for you to be like, what is that?
Okay.
It's hard to tell what's real versus what's
So do
not
you think
real.
there's a demonic element to that sometimes,
You know what?
or a spiritual element?
I've thought about that for a long time, and I don't know that I have the answer even still. I I feel like even more so than a, demonic spiritual component, I think it has so much to do with trauma. And again, the way that we were raised, the environment that we were raised in, what did that cultivate?
Yeah.
Because I know some people in my life, without getting into detail, but it's, they're experiencing delusions and they're so specific to the way that they were raised. Yeah, I won't share more,
Yeah.
but
So we'll get into this conversation now. So Jordan Peterson was talking about how we as humans should interact with other humans on a regular basis.
mm-hmm.
Have dialogue. It's the proverbial sitting around the campfire talking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He uses the term mental combat. And so when I do these podcasts, we're engaging. We're not necessarily fighting,
Right.
but we're engaging in deep discourse, which
Mm-hmm.
people don't do. I just have to do it weekly now, which is not normal, which is good. And so
That's awesome. They do it weekly. I didn't realize it was that frequent.
Yeah, forces me to think.
Yeah.
And so when guys do it, like sometimes we give a hard time about guys' night. And it's like, yes, they're doing something, but also they're kind of keeping each other in check.
Yeah.
Right? Because the guy will say something, he'll be like, dude, that's dumb. Right? So it's not some deep level, but it's like they can kind of keep within line of.
They kind of keep each other accountable.
Yes. But I don't know if women do that as well. If women, and so we talk about delusion, it's if you don't have someone or at least a few people in your life that can get past your public life. So there's a guy I like listen to, Andrew, who used to work for the CIA. He said in the CIA, a lot of what they learned was psychology, right? And so he's like, we were taught there's three phases to someone. There's a public life, their private life, and their secret life. I'm trying to get past their public life, which is what I'm trying to do here as well. I don't, like, cool, the weather's nice, you're doing well, but like, no, I actually want to get to your private.
Yeah.
Secret's kind of interesting. I don't have to get there, but it's more like your private life. And so I don't know, with guys, they kind of do that by going out and doing stuff. But with girls, I feel like a lot of it's superficial, their relationship, unless they have people that can get into their private life that actually keep them in check. So they don't have these weird, strange thoughts. Be like, no, that's not a normal thought. But if you don't have that in your life, then it's very easy to capture a thought and then to start believing that thought. And then you start having these really weird. I think it happens in both parties, both men and women, but I don't know if women open themselves enough to actually have other women in their life without going to actual therapy to help.
I guess a lot of my friends, not a lot, but several of my friends are therapists. So sometimes it's annoying to be around each other because all we do is constantly recognize patterns and things like, where's that stemming from?
And you're like, oh my goodness, I don't know the whole history.
Actually just last week I was with my friend, so two other therapists, so there were three of us, and we were watching Desperate Housewives just because there's nothing.
Why?
You know what?
You're an intelligent woman. Why are you watching this?
That's my secret. I guess that's one of my secrets is I like Desperate Housewives. But it was just so funny.
Because you want that life?
No, I mean they have a mixture of different. I think it's just really good character development, and they have all these like.
So you actually enjoy it.
I actually do enjoy it, but I want to give you an example. There's one character I'm like She seems like such a bad person, but there's still likable traits. It just shows that people are multifaceted. They're not just all good or all bad.
Do you like it?
So that is interesting to me.
You can like it because it's such an extreme, so it's obvious what that character's flaw or value is. Because they have to
but
be
then
extreme.
It changes over time.
But do you think
Their
that's
values.
real?
The changing over time? Or what do you mean?
TV show like that.
I used to think that stuff was not real, and then I hear stories every day, even at my job, about things that I'm like, oh, that sounds like it was a movie. Like it should have been a movie.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it can resemble real life.
But probably from that TV show, you probably are, whether it's conscious or subconscious, analyzing those characters. But because they do it to such an extreme, it's easier to pick out.
Right, like what their issues are.
And that's like, for as much as Alex Hormozi hates counselors or therapists, he just self-practices. Because he likes to take okay, let's take the situation and look at it from the extreme side.
I'm curious to like delve deeper into why he actually hates them. Like,
He,
what is it about therapists that he really dislikes?
because he's
Like,
been to them. So here's one thing, and I don't know where I stand
I
on
know,
this.
but if a person, okay, one thing I will say really quick is if a person tries 5, 10 different therapists, hates all of them, again, he's the common denominator, and that's time to really look inward and be like, what
Well, he
am I
does
running
look
away
inward. He
from?
does. So
Maybe to an extent.
here's a point that he makes, which I think there's some validity, because people will always ask him like, because he's worth over 100 mil now,
Hmm.
him and his wife. I think they're a great couple. They're really inspirational.
This is my first time hearing about them.
They're like, I really like the couple, and I think they're doing a lot of good.
Hmm.
But he's like, people always want to be like, because you had a traumatizing childhood, you became successful. And
Oh, like I need a reason for why.
yes,
Yeah.
and he's like, dude, you can make up whatever reason you want.
Hmm.
It's all theory, right? Because it's like researching this. It's like I think part of the reason I didn't like this when I first was introduced to this back in high school is it's a soft science,
I remember us having this conversation like 7 years ago.
very pivotal in your life. It's a soft science, so it's like it's just it's not 1 + 1 = 2,
Hmm.
right? Well, now they're questioning that.
Right.
But with soft science, it's like, hey, these are general things that
Hmm.
happen, but it's not always true. And so that he comes from it. It's like, dude, you can describe for him what he wants people to do is just take action,
Hmm.
right? Regardless of your reasoning,
Where you came from.
right? And that's what he's like, okay, you were, your whole life someone told you you sucked at life.
Hmm.
And
Right.
so, right? So
Yeah,
that's
'cause
his whole thing. It's like without he just practices therapy himself,
Mhm.
right? So but he's like another tool that he uses is take something to an extreme, right? Like my cat died after 18 months.
Mhm.
Initially I was sad, but then what if I thought cats only live 18 months? Then I'd be happy. That's just another
Mhm.
tool.
Right.
So it's
Like
like
reframing, like you were
yeah,
saying
he's just
earlier.
reframing. So it's like it's funny because he hates them so much, but it's like no, you have the mental capability to practice a lot of those tools
Mhm.
that you would probably learn.
Yeah.
But one of his big sticks was we don't always know why.
Yeah,
Because
and
we
we can
can
get
make up for
stuck
yes,
like trying to figure out the why,
right,
and it's a way to ignore, or I think to keep us from
right.
actually
Just do
doing
the
the
thing.
work. Yeah.
Just do the action to
Yeah.
get to. It's like right now my feet hurt and I'm trying to get back into running.
Mhm.
I could go figure out why, or I could just do the thing to make my feet
Mhm.
stronger.
Right.
And I think that's probably the crux of his displeasure for therapy.
Mhm.
It's if we try to live in the past so much, maybe acknowledge it, but it doesn't need to become your identity.
Yeah, and
And
that's what I
you
would
have to
say
move forward.
that's what therapy is all about. It's not about getting stuck in the past. I think it is really important to bring our blind spots, to the surface. Um, and a lot of times, as objective as we try to be with ourselves, it's just not always
Really hard.
possible. Yeah.
Most people can.
Like again, I could look at, so to mention my ex again, he was, maybe still is, like was using hard drugs and looked like it, very much looked like it, looked so sickly. And I had a lot of patients day in, day out where I knew that they were struggling with substance use and because of the way they acted, the way they looked. But I made up so many reasons without realizing it or excuses for the way my ex looked the way that he did. I thought, oh, he's literally, I remember thinking he just drinks too much soda and eats too much candy. He's just really unhealthy and that's why he looks like that. And I made up any excuse to
Because
not have to live with
you
reality.
didn't want to believe that could happen to you, or you could be married to someone like that.
Yeah, I wasn't ready to go there. And then, but looking back, and that's what I think is our brains can be so powerful that we could lie to ourselves like
Yeah.
that. Like I wanted to just stay in oblivion, basically, be completely oblivious to what was going on because that felt safer than to face the truth.
Yeah. That was a tangent. But
I'm good at tangents.
no, I took us on that tangent. But we're talking about the type of patients that you saw. So I would say they're they're already at a pretty point. They're at a stage in their life where people know something's clearly wrong. do they know that something's clearly wrong with them yet? Or is it sometimes a loved one's like,
It's
hey, this person or that
mhm.
person, when they're sitting in front of you, do they want to be there? Or,
It's it's both.
Mhm.
So we do work with a lot of people who are involuntarily detained, so they don't think they should be there, but again, they're a threat to themselves, like imminent threat to themselves or others, or considered gravely disabled. And what that means is they're not able to take care of themselves. They're not able to like resume daily activities in a safe way. So when people are involuntarily detained, a lot of the time there is a lot of denial there about why they're there. They might think it's a conspiracy, depending on.
so pretend I'm the patient now. I, you're helping me through, what's a common issue that you have that you help
So,
someone through?
and I will say, so at the psychiatric hospital, it's a very short term, like crisis centered care. Like we're just trying to stabilize them as quickly as possible. So they're only there typically for a couple of weeks. So they're there for not just anxiety and depression, like those are obviously there, but they're debilitating. So they're there maybe for
Which means
active
debilitating to
suicidality.
you, define that as can't function.
Can't function, yeah, maybe not feeding themselves, not taking care of themselves, or active suicidality. So you can be suicidal, not be hospitalized. It's not illegal. However, if they're at a point where they're planning how to harm or kill themselves, they're just completely unsafe, then they might get detained or voluntarily go to the hospital.
So when you're sitting with these people, how are you able to reframe their life?
So
What are you trying to accomplish?
an inpatient, what we were trying to accomplish wasn't even necessarily that. We were just trying to get them
Is there
to.
a team of you, so you may not be the only person they interact with?
Oh yeah, we have a very multidisciplinary team. Like there's doctors, there's therapists, of course, case managers, there's nursing staff,
Okay, so you
occupational
won't be the only
therapists.
person they're
No,
interacting with.
it's an entire treatment team.
So what piece of the puzzle do you play then? I'm
So-
sitting in front of you. What's wrong with me? Let's
What's
make an
wrong?
avatar of someone that we can flesh out.
So at a very like basic level, let's say you come in, you have bipolar disorder, you're in a manic state. The doctor's goal will be to try to get you to sleep, to make sure you're sleeping enough, and of course get you medication to help you stabilize, meaning like with your thinking, for it to be more reality based, for you to be able to keep yourself safe. My role isn't necessarily therapy at the time. Like in that moment of crisis, people aren't willing, they're not going to sit down and do actual like therapy with
It's
you.
like
It's
it's like when a parent tries to reason with a 2-year-old that's
yeah,
throwing a temper tantrum. It's like, why are you trying to reason with that child,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah, so actually, speaking of that, if someone is experiencing like delusional thinking or paranoia, I'm not going to necessarily argue with them about that. I might, like, if they're really nervous and think that the FBI or somebody is after them, I might just say, wow, that would be really scary. Like, I'd be scared too if I thought that was happening. Kind of validating their fear versus trying to argue and be like, that's not real, because that's not helpful at all.
Right.
And then they don't trust you, etc. So I think my role in the inpatient setting as a therapist is to make sure the family knows what's going on. A lot of times we'll have family meetings and educate the family. Let's say it's the person's first time in the hospital, or there's still a lot of stigma around mental health. So depending on the culture, background, lifestyle, there's a lot of resistance to mental health treatment. So doing some basic, what we call psychoeducation on what is happening here, what we think next steps are, getting them set up with a therapist and a med prescriber that they can see ongoing after they discharge from the hospital, offering some support services to the family because they're freaked out right now. They don't know how to help their loved one or how to even get help for themselves, which can be very emotional. But then also what I do in outpatient, so it's still connected to the hospital, but outpatient. Have you heard of partial hospitalization? So sounds kind of funny, I think.
Try to avoid hospitals.
Good.
And I try not to be crazy.
Crazy is not the word we
I
use.
know.
Well,
That
okay,
probably
here's
triggered me.
triggered me. No, I do believe language is powerful, and I'm sure you do too.
Yeah.
No, so what I realized actually, what I do now in outpatient, so it's called partial hospitalization program because we're doing really intensive, basically hospital level programming. So we do group therapy throughout the day. So basically, in order to be in partial hospitalization program (PHP), you go to group 5 days a week for 6 hours a day. So we'll do a bunch of skills groups or
So
psychoeducation groups.
you're like leading these groups.
Mm,
For
yeah,
6 hours, you'll be in that.
not necessarily me by myself. Like I might run several groups a day, but we have a bunch of
So what does one
different
of those sessions
therapists.
look like?
So you asked earlier, how do we help someone to kind of start reframe their thoughts? So what's really, I think what I love about group therapy is that sometimes I might go in thinking, you know what, I think they really need to learn about, we're going to talk about grief today. We're just the different stages of grief and kind of myths that we've learned about grief. And then I come in and I do the group and they're like, that was not helpful at all. Like, and sometimes it might have just been a really difficult topic for them. So it's a lot to process. But then I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I'll do a group on recognizing our early warning signs. How do we recognize as early as possible that we're becoming unwell? Our anxiety is getting out of control. We're feeling more depressed. And a lot of the people that I see in outpatient, they aren't kind of they're pretty high function, for lack of a better term, people. So they have really high pressure jobs and maybe they need to take a leave of absence for a couple of months.
So someone like I won't
Like
say his
you.
name. Me.
You might be in that part. Yeah, we have so many.
So I have a buddy, you know him. He works at Meta, and he had a mental breakdown where, and this is where I realized like you don't have to believe in something and it can still be real and
Yeah.
true, right? And
Yeah.
so it's like
when you didn't believe in psychology, but it
I
still
didn't.
was. I'm just kidding.
I just didn't like it. I was like, dude, just live life. Again, I was 17. I didn't know anything. I
Yeah.
still don't know anything.
I'm like, yeah, you're right. You don't know anything.
But when he was talking about like, dude, I literally would go into panic attacks, and I'm just like, what? And that's something you can't control. So you probably take someone like him. Like he has a family, wife, kids, but there's literally some kind of mental issue or emotional
Yeah.
that's affecting him. So he could go to treatment like this where you're trying to help this person work through. Do you try to find the root cause? Is that the kind of the goal? Do you find the root cause, or is it more like?
I mean, yes and no, but I think what we're looking at is kind of what you were talking about earlier. Like, how can we get you to a place where you can resume, maybe not go back to your old life, because, obviously that wasn't working. So let's make some positive changes, some healthy changes. But lots of like different coping skills. So yes, there's a medication piece, but it's very therapy heavy. But it's like it's quick. It's 3 to 6 weeks that they're in our program. Sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes less than that, depending on the individual person's need. But a lot of times it's just kind of getting them to recognize what anxiety looks like, what depression looks like, and that no one's safe from never feeling anxiety or depression. That's what I learned with COVID. I think the positives that I found, at least in my line of work, is that more and more people were finally coming for help. And I think COVID, like just having to be isolated, it brought a lot of things to the surface that maybe we were able to ignore and were able to just go through the motions for so long until we couldn't. And so I found so many people, I feel like the stigma has gone down at least a little bit. I don't know if that's just being surrounded by that in
No,
my
it
line of
has.
work.
And then I think media is putting a lot more emphasis on it. It's an invisible wound. Like if I see a guy with his bone sticking out,
Right.
that's pretty obvious. Like,
Yeah.
hey man, you gotta go get that fixed. But when it's a mental, emotional thing, A, it's hard to identify it, and then B,
It's not an easy fix either.
the fix is difficult because it's like it could be this, it could be that. This person had that, but
Yeah.
and so that's like listen to John, listen to Jordan talk about these things. It's like, man, it is like to have the patience to like, just you as a clinician trying to help someone and to have the empathy and to literally, I mean, you know what you're doing better than I can explain it, but it's very time consuming. It's very raw. Like, how do you de-stress from that? Because it's so stressful.
It is.
So what do you do? Do you have to almost become a different person at work so you don't take those things on? So when you're
Yeah.
off work, you're like,
Yeah.
all right, I'm done. Or how do you
That's a
de-
great,
how
that's
do
a
you
great
de-stress from
question.
that?
I've come a long way in the last 10 years of being in this field. At first, when I started at age 21, 22, I remember I would take my
It's
work
a lot
home
of
with
stress.
me. It was incredibly stressful. And I remember at the time I was also helping, like I had a lot of unhoused patients who I was trying to figure out, okay, can I get you into a homeless shelter? And I would be thinking at night, did they make it to that homeless shelter? Did they make it or not? Or I'm so nervous about tomorrow. I have treatment team meeting and I'm nervous to work with a specific doctor, and or like this patient doesn't seem to be getting better. We need to find something
Would you take it
different.
personal at the beginning?
And I think I
You're like, man, I
put way
couldn't
too
help this
much
patient.
pressure on myself. And yeah, I had such a hard time. I would feel burnout all the time. It was so hard for me.
So did
Now,
they teach you how to cope with that?
I mean, yeah, they talk about self-care and all these things, but
Check.
I was really, huh?
Keep talking.
Okay. I was really unaware of how unhealthy my way of de-stressing was. Because again, what I would do is I'd come home, I'd be physically, mentally, emotionally drained, and I would continue to think about it, ruminate on it. What do I have to do to be ready for tomorrow? Now I very much do compartmentalize, and it's not that I don't,
You care.
yeah, but there is such a thing. Have you heard of compassion fatigue?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I definitely experienced that, and I think most therapists, clinicians have experienced bouts of compassion fatigue if they're not careful and they're not taking good care of themselves. So now it's much easier for me. Like as soon as I walk out the door, I'm not thinking about work until I have to come back the next day.
Yeah, that's good. So that's something you had to develop over time.
Yeah.
So I just had a tenant of mine. She works for CPS,
hmm
and she's like, the turnover is so bad that it's like
Yeah.
workers last maybe 2-3 years before they
Yeah.
completely get out.
Yeah. That's
Because
not
you're dealing with
surprising.
traumatic kids in bad
Mhm.
situations. So would you say that's the turnover isn't as bad where you work?
At one point, I think again when I first started my career, there was an 89% turnover rate for clinicians within the first year.
Yeah.
So inpatient was it's so fast paced and so chaotic. I lasted there for 7 years.
Yeah.
Now that I'm an outpatient, it is
Well, do you think there is
easier.
a form of negative energies getting transferred to you? Is that a thing?
I mean,
You're taking on someone
yeah,
else's
yeah.
negative energy.
And now I know how to not like take it on
How
and
do you
have
do
it
that?
stay with
How do I
me.
do that with my child?
How do
Hey, that's your
Right. Well, I think part of it is recognizing, okay, I did what I could to help this person today. I sat there with them. Sometimes being there for them looks different. Sometimes they need a coping skill or technique. Should we close the window?
It's fine.
Maybe they need a coping skill or a technique. Other times they just want someone to empathize with them and sit there with them in
How do
their.
you know what that person needs?
That's a big
Are
question. It
you
would
just good at
depend.
reading people now at this point?
I mean,
That's
you
a skill
learn,
you
yeah,
develop.
you learn to. Sometimes they think they're coming in for one thing, and then I realize, oh no, it's another thing, deeper. A lot of times they're like, oh, I'm just really stressed out at work, and we find later, okay, you don't take good care of yourself, or you don't know how to take good care of yourself. Let's figure out what that actually looks like. And there's a deeper issue there. It's not necessarily the job that is stressful, but you're not good at setting boundaries. You're not good at asserting yourself with your coworkers, with your boss. So it's looking at that. And that's when I say, okay, so when they leave our program, they can continue to see a therapist specifically for how to set healthier boundaries in the workplace, in their home life. And that can have, I think, a ripple effect.
Mm-hmm.
But at surface level, they think, oh, my job is just really stressing me out. But it's how they're responding to
Mm-hmm.
their environment.
So, I mean, you have to get pretty good at taking a conversation and directing it, and then also, I'm assuming you have a framework of ideas to work with.
Like, do you
Or,
mean like
uh,
modalities or what we ask
yeah,
them?
yeah. So you have an idea of what the end could look like. It's just there's different ways of getting there.
hmm Yeah, and again, mine is so short term, so it's not like I see a client, I know I'm going to see them for at least a year every other week. I know that I have a short amount of time, again, 3 to 6 weeks. So we kind of look at, so a lot of the time I would even teach, and it might sound odd to think that I'm teaching on self-forgiveness in an intensive, like hospital-based program, but I realize, and I think we realize that so many of our issues might stem from not being able to forgive ourselves or forgiving others, or with grief. It's not just grieving the loss of a loved one. It might be a life transition. Like mothers, for example. We have mothers sometimes who feel guilty for grieving the person they were before having kids, the life that they used to have, like having much more time to themselves. So there's so we might look at like grief can come in so many different forms and for so many different reasons. Let's try to unpack that a little bit. And then there's basic things, or like CBT. Have you heard of cognitive behavior therapy? That's what you were saying earlier, basically recognizing our irrational, maybe really negative thoughts. And then how do I reframe it? How do I recognize that in the moment? How do I kind of
Well, this
change
whole
my
conversation
response?
started because of we were talking about that. So do you outside of your therapy friends, do you think women in general
Mm.
allow other women to actually keep them in check?
I will say that, so the few close friends that I do have, I think we do keep each other in check. Like we'll be honest with ourselves, therapist or not. Like one of my friends, she's not a therapist, but I definitely consider like I always call her the wise owl in my life. I don't know, I'm keeping a secret. It's Jessica Kaivronsky. She's like always very level-headed, and she'll be very gracious about it, but she'll be honest with me. And like if I ask her, hey, what do you think about this?
Yeah. And I think that's important. And if you
Mhm,
don't, like, for the listener, if you don't have people in your life that can get into your private and secret
mhm,
life, I think that's a problem.
absolutely.
Guys need it, girls need
Hmm.
it.
Yeah, someone that you could just be raw and
Yeah, because not everyone can
unfiltered
afford to
with.
go to therapy every week. And so you need people in your life that can practice that
Yeah.
with you.
But I do have to say too, because there's this misconception that friends and family can be our therapists. Totally doesn't work that way. Like people come to me and think that I can give them therapy, but it just
It's different.
there's a conflict of interest. Yeah, it's just different. It's not going to have the same impact. And I think it is on some level, even though it might be awkward and hard to talk to a stranger, it also helps us to be, I think, more honest with them, more authentic. Not necessarily more authentic, but it's easier for me to really talk about my problems with someone that doesn't really have emotion, like no investment in my life other than this appointment.
Mhm.
So I think it's really imperative that you do get, again, someone, like we were saying, who can be more objective about my situation than a friend or family member
Yeah,
would
but
be.
I think that just everyday life, if you don't have people
Oh,
that
yeah,
can be in
yeah.
your life,
Mm-hmm.
and that COVID exposed that, right? With
Mm-hmm.
isolation, people are already pretty isolated, and then
Yeah.
you added that on top of it, where
Mm-hmm.
you're just not even interacting with people at
Mm-hmm.
all. But that's what I find like. I think there's just core basic things of being a human being that can function well.
Yeah.
And part of that is, do you have quality relationships with other people?
Community. Yeah. I think about that a lot lately, especially because we are more individualistic, as a society, at least in the United States. And coming from a background like with my Slavic background where it's much more community oriented,
Hmm.
just realizing how
But
important it
that
is.
was very superficial.
How so?
The
What do you mean?
Slavic community, right? Or
Well,
I mean, your
I don't
parents
want to
telling
make it
you
sound
like
like it was so superficial. I mean, there were definitely,
beauty.
yeah, superficial aspects
Yeah,
to it, especially going to church. You need to get really dressed up and don't show your flaws.
yeah.
So
You
so
need
it turned
friends in
into
your
like a
life that
facade.
you
But,
again get can see
mm-hmm,
who you are, but not judge you for it.
mm-hmm.
Like one of my friends, when he told us his marriage wasn't good, like, bro, we already knew that, right? Because it was like him telling us, like, bro, we that
Like
was
you're
like
finally, yeah,
we knew that, but it's like, um, for him, it was a
mhm,
relief to tell us that. I
yeah,
was like, bro, like
yeah,
we knew that like years
mhm,
ago, and not that's not new news to us.
right,
But you need to have, I think, friends in your life that, like you said, there's certain burdens you don't want to burden them with.
hmm,
But if you try to carry everything on your own, that is tough.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so let's talk about relationship. Um, when you initially got married, you you thought this was the one.
For the most part, I definitely questioned it too. And I think now it's because I was questioning. I didn't know, I feel like I didn't really know who I was or what I was looking for. But I remember thinking that if I don't make it work, and this sounds like it was so horrible, but I just remember thinking, because we again dated 5 years before we got married, that if I
That's a
don't,
long time to date someone.
I
You think
know.
after 5 years you would know.
Well, we kind of I feel like we did know pretty early on, like, yeah, we're doing this for to ultimately get married.
But no, when I say you know, meaning you knew that person better.
Oh, okay.
Or would you say that person changed a lot through the marriage? Or while you were married? Not that the
Not,
marriage changed him, or did
mhm.
that individual change?
I feel like he didn't necessarily, well, he did change a lot, but I think what was happening too is he wasn't able to put on a facade anymore, like put on a mask. I think he was wearing a mask for a long time. I was too in different ways, and I think he just couldn't fake it anymore.
But for the listener, it's like, because we normally we would tell someone, hey, if you're thinking about getting married, maybe wait a year. This was 5 years.
5 years,
So you
right?
think after five, like looking at my
Yeah,
my
yeah.
situation, it was less than a year.
Hmm. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. It was so fun. That's funny.
The only reason we did get married when we did, because I was like, I was thinking like, uh, yeah, probably a couple years,
Hmm.
I'll be out, and then Jessica's mom was like, not Jessica, Gavron,
Yeah,
different Jessica.
former, yeah.
Um, but her mom being like, yeah, you guys are gonna get married like really soon, and I was just like, that wasn't even a thought in my mind. But then, no, knowing Russian culture, it's like, why
That,
would a girl
that's
not get married at
right.
19?
Hmm.
Or it's like, for me, it was like, why would a girl get married
Hmm.
at 19? For them,
Yeah.
it was why would not?
And that's why I was like, oh, I'm going to be 21.
Yeah.
Again, like, I'm not going to get married before that. But I do remember thinking if I don't make it work with this person, like to break up, because there were times where we kind of broke up, got back together. Um, Again, it was pretty
It was
tumultuous.
tumultuous.
Yeah.
So do you feel like, no, I'm the therapist. Did you,
We don't ask that as often as people think. How do you feel?
yeah,
I don't really ask that question.
you don't. So
No, not really.
that's
There's
interesting.
other ways to ask it, I think. Because people don't even know how to describe their feelings sometimes.
I don't.
Yeah.
My wife says I'm a rock.
Hmm.
Um, through that relationship before you got married, um, despite all the trauma and the tumultuous that you experience, did you marry him because you felt like that was the right thing to do?
I think that
Or
was,
you're like,
yeah.
I already invested so much time and energy to it, it would seem
Hmm.
like a loss.
Yeah. I think there were many
You didn't want to
layers.
take the L, so you're like, all right,
Yeah, there were many layers. And one of them, so I was saying earlier, because again, my parents had, I never saw them make one decision together where they were like on the same team. So that was all I knew. And so even though my ex and I were fighting a lot or having disagreements, which now I'm like, yeah, there is such a thing as just not being a good match for someone. But I thought if I break it off, then that means I can't make it work with anyone else. I'm always going to be breaking it off. So I thought that I just need to work hard, work so hard, and that as long as you love someone, you'll be compatible one day.
yeah, yeah, and it's like there's plenty of other fish out there.
I know, and people did tell me that. Honestly, my mom told me that. Um, my dad did too, but again, I didn't really respect my dad's
Right.
opinion. Or, I love my parents, but I do not go to them for marital or
Yes.
like relationship advice.
Do you think of that? So one thing I was telling my niece, and one thing I'm learning more now, it's you should have one thing I encourage is you should have friends not just your age, but also 10 years, 20
Hmm.
years, 30 years. Did you have that at that point in your life? Did you have
Not,
adults that you highly respected and appreciated that were significantly just beyond
mhm.
like now if I would tell a married couple, ideally you have friends in your life, maybe not friends, but someone that was willing to check in on you that's 10
Like a
years.
mentor almost.
It's almost a mentor, but it's more of a unofficial like just like you have friends, right? You don't like, so you're officially my friend, right?
Mhm.
You're just like, you're your friend. But it's like, go out of your way to have people in your life that are 10 years older than you,
Mhm.
20 years older than you, 30 years older than you, because they can give you different perspective.
Yeah.
It's part
Yeah.
of the reason I started this podcast
Mhm.
is when I talk to a 75-year-old, very different perspective
Yeah.
on life than me at 35, right? Um, but I think as young people, we generally only have friends that are age group, unless they're our parents.
I have a lot of maybe like through, well, actually most of them I met through work, but I have a friend that she's 61 years old, just turned 61,
You
and
met her through work.
through work, and she's a nurse. I'm a therapist. We worked in the same office. We just became like best friends
Mm-hmm.
at work, and it was so much fun. We would kind of bicker with each other. She's from New York, and people would always say, "You guys act like you're sisters," or like, "Are you really mad at each other right now?" And
Mm-hmm.
we were just so close. So I spent time with her and her husband, and sometimes her kids too. So
Yeah,
I
I
feel
think
like
that I that's good.
I've never struggled with
Yeah,
like the age. That was never so important to me.
that's healthy. And I would just I'm what I'm trying to say is if you're young, go find those type of
Hmm.
relationships.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
I didn't have that when I was a young person.
I don't think I did necessarily like a 20 either. I think around, if I guess I found a lot of my friends who are still like people I really care about to this day through work. Um, and then through church as well, I had mentors that were
Mm-hmm.
older, but it wasn't necessarily, it didn't feel really like friendship necessarily. It was very much like a mentor, spiritual
Yeah.
guide relationship.
So you got married. Um, how was that first year?
It was very rocky, and not just his fault. Like it was
Yeah.
my fault too. I think I had really unrealistic expectations of him. And there's this idea, like, unless you're working through your own issues, there's this idea, and I think we're taught it through media, like movies all the time, that someone's going to rescue you. They're going to come and rescue you from your own
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think
You're his princess and
yeah,
you're
and
supposed to.
so I had these unrealistic expectations that life was just going to be magically easier when we got married, as if something was going to change from like dating to marriage. But also, I think a part of it, and I didn't realize this at the time, I get just like in hindsight, recognizing that I think I married so young as a way to like escape my dad, or like living at home, because in the Slavic culture, like the Christian Slavic culture, you have to stay with your parents. Like you don't have to, but that's just the way people do it. They're living at home until they get married. Like that's when they get to move out. So I think that was a big part of it. Like I was just like, okay, I'm getting my master's. I'm still living at home, commuting to school every day. And
Did you love him?
as much as I like, as much as I knew to love someone at the time, I think my definition of love is different now.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned to you earlier, even like what I look for in a person, the qualities I look for are completely different now. And I used to look at someone where like they were just very, let's say they made me feel calm. I felt calm around them. They were very consistent, stable. I used to think, oh, they're boring. Like that's so boring,
Mm-hmm.
because I was so used to growing up in a chaotic environment. So again, without realizing it, kind of trying to recreate that pattern when I was dating other people, and I thought, oh, this is chemistry. I have butterflies in my stomach. In reality, it was like anxiety. I didn't know what to expect. It was unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought that was, oh, that's fun. That means I'm really interested in them. You
Mm-hmm.
know, there's something here.
Yeah, that's like you hear this the stereotype of the girl attracted to the bad boy,
Hmm.
and it's like, why?
Yeah, and I don't know that I ever thought my ex was a bad boy by any means, but it's probably some
Yeah.
of that. Yeah.
So you're married. When are there red flags early on, where you knew, or is this kind of like,
Yeah, I mean, so there were a lot, I mean, with his, and not to bash on him by any means, because again, I had red flags with myself, and I had very unrealistic expectations, I think, of anyone who was going to fill that
so
role.
here's a red flag I saw
Hmm.
when you guys initially got married. You had a degree, he had no degree.
Hmm.
And that right there was not that I don't even, I wouldn't say everyone needs to go to college today, but like
Right.
that was kind of interesting. Here's this girl who has literally getting her
Uh-huh.
master's, and he barely finished high school.
Yeah, I forgot about that. You're right. But then
I knew he
he was
is
still smart,
he's very
right?
intelligent.
Yeah.
Uh,
in certain ways.
he's a
Yeah.
high IQ.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make you good at everything. It just means that
No.
he can,
Right. No emotional intelligence.
yeah.
Right.
But yeah, that to me that was a red
Mm-hmm.
flag. I was like, this person. But if you look at my relationship, I have mastered. My wife doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right. And I never really looked at that. And even that, if we were to dig deep, I realized at one point, I was just like, no, I'd never date a doctor because I've worked with doctors and they have like a God complex.
mhm.
And then, oh, I don't want to date another therapist because that's too similar to what I do. And I realized I was just saying no to a lot of different things. And I think part of it was I grew up with a negative core belief that I'm not smart. And I know where that stems from. It stems from
Where does that stem
what
from?
I heard from my dad growing up. And again, I think he was just projecting his own insecurities, but telling us in his own ways, like, or just saying to my mom or to us, like, you're not smart. And that's why he, even, like, he was the reason, he was the person who was like, I don't know if you're going to get into college, basically.
Have you personally resolved your issues from the poor childhood? You feel like at this
It
point?
comes in waves sometimes. Sometimes I feel at peace and I'm like, okay, there's a lot of things, like recognizing that I even had that negative core belief. And so I feel like I've worked hard to shift that and recognize, nope, I'm not dumb. But truly, that was a belief like people are going to think I'm dumb, or they're going to find out one day that I'm actually not smart enough to be at this treatment team or in this group of people. Um, so there's like certain pieces where I think I've worked really hard to move past, to forgive, recognize again, my parents had a hard time, like their own really difficult experiences, and they don't know the right things to say all the time. Kind of like you were saying, like even with your own kids, like they're not perfect.
Back to
So
Alex. He didn't have a good relationship with his mom. Took a psychology
my
class.
dad,
Alex
is there
Hormozy didn't have a
oh, I was like, my dad? How do you know my dad's name is
Alex
Alex?
Hormozy didn't have a good relationship with his mom, and for psychology, he had to write a story from her perspective.
Hmm.
I think she was an alcoholic, and when he wrote the story from her eyes, then he realized,
Hmm.
oh, I don't need to be mad at her anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's funny because he just practiced self therapy all the time.
Hmm.
He's been through all the therapists that he can now do it himself. But that was once he put himself in her shoes to be
Hmm.
like, oh no, what she didn't have the tools to treat me
Hmm.
well. So it only makes sense
Yeah.
that she treated me that way.
Hmm. At the same time, it goes back to what you were saying though, at one, like we can't always use that
Right.
as a reason to harm like the people we're around,
Right.
right? We
Yeah,
have to
that's why
take, yeah,
like if I had I'm sure my wife can name all my flaws, but it's like
we all have them.
but at some point I need to take responsibility of those flaws
Hmm.
and try to do something about it.
Yeah,
Where that's where I think there's a huge disconnect. Like, um,
right.
my dad never played with me when
Hmm.
I was growing up. I could be like, well, my dad never played with me, so I'm not gonna play with my kids.
Hmm.
And it's like I can count on my
Yeah.
hand how many times my dad actually played with me.
Hmm.
My kids can count on their hand in a day how many times I played with them,
Right.
right?
So you're
So
not allowing that pattern to
no,
continue.
yeah. So it's like I love my parents.
Hmm.
Um, did they raise me in the best way? No, but I'm not defined by that,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, and
Um,
I think that's the key because it can be safe and comfortable. And I know I've done this before too, like to fixate like on a label. Like you were saying, oh, I
and
need
I
to
think
find the root cause of
that's
this.
why another reason I didn't like psychology
Hmm.
before was I remember I took a personality test in high school, and I took the test, and it was like all these I don't know if your high school did this, but mine was like trying to prepare you for the
Is it like the Myers-Briggs or whatever?
it
One of
was all
those.
sorts of things, and it was like it said my occupation was to be a bus driver. I was like,
Oh,
what is going on? Like, really, I'm going to take all
silly.
these questions, and maybe that's why I like just hated that whole
Yeah,
field,
because it
because
tried to
because
define your future.
yeah, and it's like a lot of it is just you try different things, right?
Hmm.
They're not always correct the first way, and it's the same way with like in the medical field, even with hard science.
Yeah.
Someone someone comes in sick, they don't
Hmm.
always know the issue. It's very obvious if it's a broken leg, but if it's something else, so once my initial exposure to psychology wasn't great,
Right.
so then I was just wrote it
Well,
off
I'm
because I
glad you
was just like
reflected on that a little bit more to find out like where's that coming from?
because it's like a lot of it's just guess. You don't
Yeah.
know. You don't always know.
Hmm.
The if you're in the field, then you're able to quickly adapt to your client, right? to their
Hopefully.
needs.
I mean, and again, going back to like diagnosing, the label isn't necessarily going to answer every question, and we don't want to get stuck on that, but it can provide some relief to
Yeah.
people who are like, what is going on? It gives at least some clarity on what's happening. At the same time, yeah, we don't want to identify with it, because sometimes I definitely find clients, and again, I can relate to this sometimes too, where I'm like, oh, that's because of this and that. So it's almost like a learned helplessness where
Yes.
I don't have to figure out this issue because my brain is just like this. So it can be like a cop out sometimes. So not wanting to get stuck in that.
And I think that's why I didn't like it initially, because it's like, um, this says because of how I did this questionnaire, this is the type of person who I am. But then I
Mine
feel
was
like,
interpreter.
huh?
Mine
Yeah,
said
yeah,
I'd be an interpreter. I'm like, oh, just because I'm bilingual.
yeah. And it's like, but also for me, depending on what room you're in, you may act a certain way,
Right.
right? So if I'm in this scenario, then I may be more introverted. If I'm in this scenario, I may be more extroverted. And even those two terms, I think they've changed the definition of that, right? Like my initial
Like there's
understanding,
different types of extroversion versus.
just how they define those terms, I think they've changed. Because it's like some people are like, I'm an introvert. What does that mean?
Like you
Well,
get energized from being alone.
yeah, and I think they're even changing the definition of that
And
today.
there's ambivert, which is a hybrid of the two.
Which I would say I was, because it was
Yeah,
just like I get energy from
same.
being alone. Obviously, I enjoy talking to people if I'm doing this.
Yeah, it's
Um,
energizing to be with people as well. Yeah.
if I'm having a quality conversation, I don't like small talk anymore. Like,
Did
just
you ever?
no.
Yeah. I
I
know it's
never did
awkward.
well with, when you had to go to like a social function
Ugh, yeah.
that was somewhat work related. I hated this because it was just like you're just talking about dumb stuff. Yeah, I still don't like this.
Like surface level stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's power in having frameworks that you can be like, okay, this is when you give someone a label, then it gives them some idea. We just have to make sure don't make that your identity, because at some point,
Yeah,
otherwise
it
you're out
keeps
of
you
it.
stuck. I think
Yeah.
it really, and again, I can
So do
attest
you
to that in
probably
my
try
own
not
life.
to label you probably try not to tell them their label, or do
No,
they
not
find it helpful?
necessarily. We have to diagnose them for, insurance purposes to prove that we're doing work with them, that we're making progress. Um, Sometimes it depends. We might not, we've, they have access to their medical records. So if they ask for a diagnosis, we'll absolutely give it to them. At the same time, sometimes like the doctor, I really appreciate both of the doctors I work with, but one of them in particular, he very much is not focused on the diagnosis, but okay, how do we improve your life for the better right now? Like, what are the tools you're going to learn? What are the lifestyle changes you're going to make so that your life improves regardless of your diagnosis?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so back to your marriage. You've been married a couple years now.
Or it was past tense.
Past that, back to
Just
your
to clarify for listeners.
um, at what point did you start seeing the cracks?
It wasn't, the cracks were always there. It's that when did I become aware of them? And I mentioned earlier that I was choosing in a way, like in denial. You don't necessarily choose to be in denial, but I felt really comfortable there, where you don't necessarily see that you're in denial when you're in denial.
Unless you're Alex Ramosi.
Yeah. And I just remember like keeping things a secret from my parents. Like I never wanted that. They didn't know that my ex wasn't working anymore. He worked maybe the first year of our marriage and then decided to stop working to pursue his his patent, his invention. And I did feel very much like not manipulated, maybe that sounds harsh, but like forced into agreeing to that. Like I didn't want to be the only person working.
You
And
didn't want to be the breadwinner.
yeah, and at the time too, I wasn't making like the greatest money anyway. Like I had just graduated with my master's, very new into my career, and it was a lot to handle. And then I started realizing, I think that like he was so focused on making something of himself, and in his eyes, it was kind of chasing what you might call a pipe dream. Like if I become a millionaire, or if this patent blows up and everyone knows about it, then I'll finally make something of myself. And so I realized what I used to think was confidence was not even just arrogance. In my eyes, I think arrogance is just insecurity. It's masked, masked insecurity. So wait, what was the question? I'm already like all over the place in my head. But well, when did I start to see the cracks? I think it was definitely oblivious like the first year, even though we just constantly butt heads. We did not know how to communicate. And this is where I realized.
Because you're really good at communicating, or you're learning how to communicate. Would you consider yourself a good communicator now?
It depends on the context. I feel like I do always try to like improve my communication. But what I realized at the time, like I had one friend who would love to go deep all the time, like it was very profound, and it made me uncomfortable. And I was like, oh, do we have to be so deep right now? Like I used to feel much safer, much more comfortable in surface level conversations and relationships. So my relationship with my ex was actually very surface level. I didn't realize it at the time. Now,
would you say that though? I think for a young listener, that's normal to not be deep in your early 20s.
I'm not saying like super deep, but I'm saying having some sort of awareness of.
Not the part with your spouse, superficial. I'm talking about the earlier part where you said, I didn't want to have deep conversations. And I think that's typical of just being a young person.
Maybe. I think that could definitely contribute to it. At the same time, I think I just didn't realize what emotional intelligence was. And I feel like I didn't have emotional depth. It's not to say I had zero emotional depth, but I was afraid to go there, especially in a romantic relationship. So I might be much more vulnerable with my trusted friends or like a mentor than I was with my husband at the time. And I think for him, it was the same thing. It was never modeled to him what it meant to be vulnerable with someone and have it be like a safe space for that.
Right.
So looking back, I was just on autopilot. I keep saying that, but that was the biggest realization for me, is that I was just kind of going through the motions, making decisions every day without much thought. Like maybe I thought I was putting a lot of thought into like, why did I marry this person? Why did I pursue this program or this degree? And now looking back, I was just like, oh, that's what was really happening.
So here's what's interesting. You keep using the word autopilot. And for my wife, I don't normally talk to young girls, but I was at the gym and I talk to almost everyone at the gym. And there was a young girl from Colombia, and I was talking to her. It's so funny now because it's like we don't even talk about the public life. We go straight into and she's 22 years old, and she's like, I feel like I'm just going through the motions of life. It's like, man,
she's already aware.
At 22. Awesome. Well, it's awesome, but it's also, it's really depressing if you don't have someone that can walk you through it.
But I think but hopefully like she's not going to stay stuck in that. I don't know. Like she's already talking about it. I think that's great.
Well, I was thinking about her plight. And what's interesting, here's what was super interesting. She knew a lot of the podcasters I listened to. She knew Layla Hermosi. She knew Iced Coffee Hour. And so I was thinking about that more because I listened to a lot of these podcasts as well. And I was like, what's happening is, and I've been guilty of this, if you listen to someone else's life too much, or if you see someone else's life too much, but don't have a life of your own, that can get kind of depressing. And so I think, because she was like, I thought I wanted to be, because she got a real estate license, she's going to college, but she doesn't know why. She's going through the motions. Yeah. Someone told me to get my license. Someone told me to go to college. She's literally like, what you're saying is what she was describing.
Yeah.
Thankfully, she doesn't have a boyfriend. She doesn't marry the wrong guy. But it was interesting because it's like.
But I will say, okay, we can get back to this. But having to initiate that divorce was one of the best decisions ever. We can talk about that.
But she's at 22. She's like, she doesn't have a why. She doesn't know. Yeah. She doesn't have like those core things, and I think people can stay in that for years if they don't have.
Yeah,
someone
absolutely.
that can. She needs to meet you, and you can counsel her through. But
I can have a conversation with her as like an acquaintance, not necessarily.
Yeah, and I was kidding about the counsel part. But it's just interesting, at 22, she was like, she just had a moment with her friend, like, I don't have any
Mm.
friends here.
Yeah.
I don't have any real relationships. She's like, being friends with girls is really tough. Um, and just,
Yeah, I already want to be like, I wonder why it's hard for her to.
yeah. So that was interesting hearing that, but she was just like, when you have no purpose, the saying, when you have no vision, you perish.
Yeah, yeah.
And um, that's you saying that was just reminding me of her
Hmm.
where she's at it. Like I think back, it's like, dude, your early 20s, you should be having a ton of fun, right? It
Hmm.
should be joyful,
Which is more like
loving life.
that surface level stuff.
When I'm okay with that,
Yeah.
um, if you get too caught up in the deepness of life, it's
Hmm.
like one thing, because I'm not a trained therapist, I know that the longer I do this, I could potentially open up something,
Hmm.
but not have the tools to close it. So
Hmm.
I could open someone
I'm
up,
so glad you recognize that because people do that all the time.
so I could like accidentally open
Yes.
someone up and then just not put them
Like
back together
traumatize them and then not know how to
and be like, all right, good talk, and then
see you
bye.
later.
So that's why
Yeah.
I'm not as worried when I do it to older people because it's
Hmm.
like, dude, you're like 40 years ahead of me.
Hmm.
So I'm not too worried about that. But if I continue to talk to people
Yeah.
my age group, um, then I have to be a lot more aware. Like, it's like knowing one thing about being an electrician, but not knowing everything, and then
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
blow the house down. So it's like I have to be careful of that because I should probably do a little bit more reading on this stuff and have more tools and framework.
I think it's great that you recognize that.
Um, but yeah, it was interesting hearing that because
Hmm.
she was going through the motions of life, and now she's kind of paused,
Hmm.
where she's just like, now what?
I think those moments are healthy. I know you said she's young, 22.
Mhm.
Um,
So what would you tell that girl? Continue going
well,
through the
here's what,
motions?
no, not going through the motions. I think the fact that she is recognizing she is going through the motions, she's pausing, she's like taking a step back to reflect. I know that for me, I went through this like cocoon.
Because I think the reason I bring her up because I think a lot of
Hmm.
girls and guys are in
Hmm.
that situation.
Yeah, and I think we do. I think it's normal even to experience moments like that throughout different stages of our life. So I mentioned for me, it was like this cocoon phase where I just started withdrawing from what was my regular usual social circle, or like going through the motions. Like I went to church every Sunday and I volunteered there. And so this is what my Sundays looked like. And then we'd have meetings after church, or sorry, after
So you felt
work.
like you're
And
doing it out of duty rather than
yeah, and
desire.
I was like reflecting on why am I doing this? Is it because I'm afraid to say no? And a lot of it was that, like, I'm afraid to say no. I feel like I'm going to let somebody down because at that time I needed a break. Like I was so physically exhausted from work. I think from like, having gotten divorced
Hmm.
and just never really taking a break. And like you were saying, just having fun, like being joyful again or playful. Like I
Hmm.
didn't make a lot of time for that. It was just work, 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 church, work, work, work. And it was so exhausting. So I went through this phase where I did just kind of withdraw from everyone. And and I started reevaluating my friendships, all my friendships. Like, why am I friends with this person? Am I just friends with them because I grew up with them, like childhood friends? And there was one friendship in particular where I think we both realized it almost felt like a breakup, like in a romantic relationship. That was my first time where I kind of ended things with a friend because I realized, okay, what am I looking for a friendship, or what kind of person do I want to be in a friendship? And I realized in that particular friendship, I was not who I didn't like the kind of person that I was,
Hmm.
and I didn't appreciate what I was getting back either.
This is with a girl or a guy?
With a girl, yeah. So I realized, wow, I don't like feeling like this. And I looked at kind of the qualities and the things I appreciate in my current friendships. So I
Did you
started
actually
to
have an
just,
official like conversation with
yeah.
her and we ended it?
Well, it was more like I hadn't seen them in a while. I don't know, yeah, she came over and talked about all these different things that she didn't appreciate about me.
You're like, I don't have time for that
And
in my life.
well, I was just like, oh my. And then I think she felt probably really judged by me, but I just realized, oh wow, I'm never going to meet this person's expectations, like these unrealistic expectations they have of me. Whereas I looked at my other friendships and I was like, okay, they will put me in check. They'll let me know if I'm not behaving appropriately or
Yeah.
whatever, but I also feel like I feel supported by them.
Hmm.
I can trust them. Like I feel like they cherish me as a human being. They accept me like as I am
Hmm.
versus picking me apart and being like, you need to do this or you
Yeah.
need to change
Yeah, at
this.
some point in a
Hmm.
friendship, in a marriage, you have to, to me, I think you have to accept that person for who they
Absolutely.
are.
Yeah, and love them for who they are,
Hmm.
recognizing again, I'm a I am a big believer in having a growth mindset. So yes, I always want to improve myself, but I think that can even a lot of times people are running away from something or don't want to face who they are. So their way of kind of I think they can get really sucked in, like almost addicted to self-help or like improve
Yes.
self-improvement where it's unhealthy. It's not healthy anymore.
I
Um,
definitely went through a phase like that.
I think I did too. So now I'm like, okay, I can pause. I don't always have to be reading a book where I'm learning something. That's why I love fiction. I love reading something that I'm not necessarily going to learn
Hmm.
something from.
Especially in your line of work, where it's so heavy. It's
Hmm.
so, you're
Yeah.
dealing with such heaviness more than the average person that
Mhm.
you need something probably
Yeah, I
lighthearted.
mean, I hear about
You need desperate
suicide all day
housewives.
long, and that's why it's like I need
So I
something
won't
that's
judge you on
really,
that anymore.
go ahead, you can judge me, I just won't care. But just finding something like dumb or funny and
Yeah,
playful.
yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's like I watch TV shows, and yeah, that's kind of like my
It's
little
yeah,
thing.
it's like a form of escape.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but if you, it's interesting. Anything that you do, there's a lot of good things out there that can turn into bad things, right?
Oh yeah.
Running five
Yeah.
miles is good, and running ultra marathons not good.
Or like binge watching
Yeah,
TV to the point where I haven't talked to anyone in a month
yeah,
versus like, yeah, I'll watch it for a couple of
yeah.
hours, but then I get back to it.
Healthy dose
Yeah.
of most things.
Yeah.
Um, this all started with, oh, there was another thing I wanted to ask you, but maybe we won't go down that. But the difference between confidence and arrogance.
Hmm.
Where do you draw the line on that? How do you portray, especially as a young person
Hmm.
who's listening? Because I think a lot of times when I was younger, people said I was arrogant
Hmm.
when I thought I was confident.
I think confidence is quieter. Not than you, I'm saying
Yeah.
just in general than what I used to think. I used to think if people were really outgoing, loud, kind of like in your face and not afraid, that they were really confident. But now I realize it's quieter, it's more consistent. Like I can appreciate someone who will share something with me that they know, like they're honest with me about something and it's gonna hurt. Like so being able to be upfront with someone but still be kind
Hmm.
through the process, not like having it be at someone else's expense. So going back to even like when I said I very much look for different things now in a romantic relationship than I did in the past. In the past, I looked for someone who was maybe more extroverted than I was, just looked more confident on the outside. But then I started to realize, okay, like actually, I like stability, security, consistency. To me,
Yeah.
and I know that's not necessarily like a synonym for confidence or anything, but I think it's quieter and
Yeah, I mean, I always thought, but again, it's perception. Uh, it's whatever you say can be perceived
mm,
however. So sometimes you can't control someone
yeah.
else's. Because I there's my senior year of high school, when I went back to that school, a lot of the people said I was arrogant, and I was like,
Mm,
dude, I knew what I believed,
yeah.
and I practiced those,
So in their
and
eyes, that was,
they felt self-judged because I had
mm,
strong beliefs that
yeah.
they were okay with smoking, they were okay
Hmm.
with doing things that maybe I wasn't okay with. I
Hmm.
didn't judge them for it. They just, and you can't always control that.
Yeah.
Or I remember when I started one of my jobs, they were like, "Oh, you came into the office like you own the place," and I was just like,
So
"No."
because of their insecurities, they think that you're now
Yeah,
arrogant.
sometimes you can't control
Yeah.
that part. It's because
Right.
I don't consider myself loud or rambunctious
Hmm.
or
No, and I think you can be
yeah.
confident and be loud and rambunctious. I just realized for me, confidence, not necessarily that the person is quieter,
Hmm.
but confidence in itself doesn't have to be so bold and loud all the time,
Yeah,
right?
because as a young person, you're always. I remember trying to get a job as a younger person. They always want 5 years of experience, and
Hmm.
you're like, dude, I just finished school. How am I
How
supposed
does
to
that
get
work?
this job
Right.
without 5 years experience? So it's like, how do you portray confidence but not without the arrogance?
Hmm.
So you've been married a couple years now. Marriage isn't necessarily getting better,
No, I think
probably getting,
it was getting worse.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then what?
Well, so the most bizarre thing to this day is that when so like I'm kind of iffy on the timeline. I can't remember exactly how things happened or how things unraveled. But even when I told him and I told the family, I think you might have been, or your wife was part of the group text. And I don't even know why I felt like I had to tell everyone, but just for clarity, like, okay, I'm going to pursue a divorce. And at the time, I was like, I don't actually want.
That was when you sent the separation thing out.
Yeah. I was like, I need to separate my finances. I need to take care of myself. And, there were so many periods of our marriage where we weren't even living together. I had no idea where he was half the time. He was like Ubering or doing who knows what.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I need to get out of this because the 4 months prior to me getting the separation, we were living at his parents. It was supposed to be very short term, like a month or two, because the place that we lived at prior, the owners sold. Yeah, they were selling it. We weren't going to buy it. So he suggested, why don't we go live with the in-laws? And I was really hesitant about that. I was just like, oh, I need my space. And so I think 4 months of that, I realized, okay, I don't think he's going to get a job. And again, getting a job wasn't even the big issue. That was kind of like on the surface, right? There was a reason for him not working, for him being the way that he was. And so finally, and I was telling you this earlier off camera, that my dad, who's very like, has religious beliefs, was like, you know what? Don't usually believe in divorce, but I think you need to divorce this guy. And actually, he told me that 2 years prior to me actually finally getting a separation. I was just not ready to hear. I was like, no, I don't think I can imagine even doing that. I want to be supportive. And my idea of supportive at the time was basically enabling this behavior. At the time, I thought, like, I need to basically help him no matter what. If I'm going to be a good wife. So I think part of it was, how am I being perceived by others? I want to be a good wife. I need to do whatever I can, even if it's at my expense, to make sure that he can work on his dreams. He can pursue his dreams.
Because in your wedding vows, you say, through sickness and health, you say all these vows, and then you're like,
never mind.
At what point is it, do you fulfill your duty?
Yeah. And so I think, and he would say things that I now realize were red flags. But I would say, hey, can you get a job? And he's like, one day, don't worry. I'm like, this idea is going to make us millions. So you're going to work hard now so that later on we can enjoy this. And when I said, like, this job is so hard, and I'm not to rant, but this job is so hard, I might need to work somewhere that maybe pays less. And he was just like, no, you should be so grateful for this job that you have. And I was like, I'd be so grateful. You also got a job.
Yeah.
Anyway, what was the original question?
Just the unraveling of the marriage. Because I think a lot of women can relate, because they're, not that divorce is an interesting topic, because it's like, a lot of times we give women the hard time because they're saying 80% of divorces are initiated by the women. But then it's like, but they're doing that because the man is doing something generally. It's not because
and usually women are like trying to express that. Like, I very much tried to express what was going on. This wasn't working. This is not working. This is not working. And then at one point, that's when I finally realized, okay, I can't control his behavior. Like, I keep wanting him to change. In this case, like, even just getting a job. And I realized that's not my responsibility. Like, I can't do that. I can't expect that of him. I don't have that much control over anyone's life. So I realized what I can control is at least maybe get a separation. Again, at the time, I didn't think I was going to get divorced even then. But 1 month into it, I just realized, it was like, I don't know what happened, but I just realized, I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I was saying earlier, what was so bizarre is that when I finally did the separation, he had to sign papers. He only after that told me that he was using, I think he just said heroin at the time. He didn't mention anything else.
So he admitted that right
Only
before or
after,
afterward?
after. So that was another reason I didn't trust him because he was not forthcoming with anything. I think
Mm.
he lied about absolutely everything. And I feel like he only shared that with me to see if maybe I'd feel some sort of compassion, be like, oh, okay, well, let's try to work on this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I just think it's so bizarre that it didn't even occur to me that he was on drugs, looking at how he
I
looked
think
and
we
his
knew that.
behavior. I think everyone did. And they actually, a lot of my friends were like, oh, yeah, we thought you knew he was using meth and heroin. And like, we thought you knew. And again, I would be able to identify someone easily,
Yeah,
right? And
if he was your patient, you'd be like, dude.
like, yeah, let's get you some help. Like, how can we work through this? And but with my ex, I made up any excuse as to why. Again, I just remember thinking, and now I'm like, how did I believe this? I don't think I did truly, but it was a way of like not not going
It's
nuts.
just, it's
But
hard to, it's like when it happens to you, it's like,
mhm,
oh,
right,
hard to
yeah,
accept that truth that something like that could happen
definitely.
to me.
Yeah. How did
Because
I
we
not see it
expect a
coming?
fairy
Could I have
tale
prevented
life.
it? Mm-hmm.
And then when you don't get the fairy tale,
Mm-hmm.
accepting that
Yeah.
uh, realization.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so then emotionally, I'm sure that was a tough time in your life.
Yeah. But I didn't fall apart until after the divorce,
Wow.
actually.
So let's
I
talk about
because
that.
I was in survival mode. And I think even like going back to childhood, I remember like feeling like I'm walking on eggshells all the time, being really nervous about my dad's mood, making sure we don't get him angry, if he's frustrated, just like being really quiet and timid. And then now when I go back like to family, I go back home, I'm like, ah, 2 hours, I'm out of here. I can't handle
Yeah.
it. So I think it's similar thing where I was in survival mode. So again, that denial I think really kept me going. Um, but afterwards, and I am going to share that you actually sent me a video of my ex doing some things. I think the Pierce County
Mhm.
Sheriff's Department, um, if that's okay to share.
Yeah.
And you said, like, if you are second guessing your choice to follow through on this divorce, basically, like, or that you made the right choice or not, like, look at this. Um, and I remember, I think it was like a day or two later, after seeing that video, it was very shocking to see those things in action. Like, yes, I might have heard of those things or didn't want to believe any of those things, but to see it, I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's him. Um, so I remember, have you heard of labyrinthitis?
Mhm.
It's like extreme. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but it's like the best way to describe it for me is it was like extreme vertigo. I remember at work, I felt like a little bit unsteady on my feet and I almost tripped over myself. And I was like, that's weird. Why do I feel so wobbly? And
Mhm.
then by noon, I felt like I was completely intoxicated. And I told my boss, I was like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I feel drunk.
Mhm.
And I wasn't. But I was like, I can't like stand up
Have you been
straight.
drunk before?
I have. Um, so it felt very like disorienting. And I remember I barely made it to my car without like toppling over. And then I was driving, kind of like squinting my eyes. I'm like, I just need to get home. And then by the time I got home, like I couldn't be in the light. If I turned my head a little bit too much, I would throw up.
Mhm.
Um, and that lasted for 2 weeks. And I mean, a lot of doctors are like, well, that's probably just because you were you in the airplane recently, vertigo issues. But I really think, and my boss at the time, like, I just feel like my body was finally like, you can crash now or like relax.
Yeah.
And it just kind of fell apart because it was just holding on to so much chaos and
Mhm.
trauma.
Yeah,
It was,
that's what I learned a lot from John
mhm.
Deloney when he talks about that. When your body, what's he say? Your
The
body,
body keeps the score.
body
But
keeps a score, and it when people call in and they're like, I don't know why I or like a high achiever, I'm a really high achiever, and now I have no motivation. And he's
mhm.
like, well, because of this, and so yeah, he's definitely given me a lot of that. It's actually common that your
Yeah.
body will shut
Our
down.
body will, yeah, and I think it'll try to scream at us and like tell us something's wrong.
Mhm.
But a lot of times we're really good at ignoring it. Like I know I realized like I was so disconnected from my body. Like I just always ignored it, lived in my head. And then finally it was like, I'm done screaming at you. You're just gonna fall apart because you're not taking care of yourself. And
So
that
did that
forced me to
resolve itself
rest.
in those 2 weeks, or you just
Yeah, for the most part, like I remember I took like a leave of absence from work just rested a lot. I got to the point where I could read books like this and just not move my
So it's
neck.
like your body was practicing self-detox.
Yeah, yeah, self-detox, self-care, like just resting, which I think a lot of us can relate to, like always feeling like we need to be super productive. And I always felt guilty for resting. Now I realize, no, like you can absolutely rest. It's not like a leisurely thing you should do. In fact, it should be part of your routine. I'm moving my hands around a lot. So that, yeah, I just remember it was shortly after I saw that video. It was like, okay, this really, really is the end. And yeah, it was. And then what's interesting to me is kind of the ripple effect that the divorce had after, because people think, I think sometimes, oh, well, if you initiated the divorce, it's probably easier on you. But it was so hard to make that decision and then go through with that decision and then unlearn everything I learned about relationships and, struggling with trust. Like that was,
So is
I
that
think,
when you started going therapy yourself?
yeah, when my boss was like, I really think you should go because she's a therapist too. Yeah, because actually, what I did first before going to therapy is I got a second job. So I already had a really stressful job at this hospital where I worked full time. And then I don't know if you know Rudy from Rudy and Tasha. Well, a friend of mine, and I really wanted to. I was like, it's always been on my bucket list to work at a restaurant, like as a waiter, waitress.
I think I remember
And
someone telling me.
so I did that for like 8 months. And so right after work, I'd like go to El Gaucho. This is where I worked, fine dining. It was like totally new world. To me, it's way more stressful to be like a server than it is to work in a psychiatric hospital. I just felt so out of my element. And I realize now, like, that was a distraction for me. It was a way for me to cope with like the initial reaction, the fact that have gotten divorced, like this future that I thought I was going to have with this person, no longer there.
As John would say, that version of you had to die.
Yes, and it did, and it was painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I've learned a lot from him, but one thing he talks about, like, I've been on a big personal development thing over the past few years, ever since COVID. I was into personal development in my 20s, but now it's been just a lot more deliberate. And one thing he talks about is sometimes when you are personally developing, people around you won't like it
Yeah. Oh my gosh, my family did not like it. Yeah.
because you just killed a version of yourself that everyone else was comfortable with.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, and that can be really painful. So you have to like explain to them, be like, yeah, I killed that version of myself.
Yeah.
I think with my wife, she's just like, she just knows I'm always trying new things. Like there was a phase of my life I did a ton of fasting. And I was asking her about it.
Yeah.
She was just like, that's just another thing you did.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you kill an old version of yourself
Yeah.
and you have to become a new one. And he talks about that in marriage. Like,
Right. Like you're married to a different person every time, right?
well, he talks about uh, if the marriage has gone through a difficult situation, you end up ending that version of your marriage, and then as a couple creating a new marriage, which was language I wasn't as familiar with before. So you are killing something old, but then you're going through the steps of creating something new. So for you, it's like, hey, we ended that. Now I have to go create a new version of myself. And I think a lot of people probably don't do that next step, right? They end the divorce and then they're just a mess, and they let that trauma continue to control them, where you took the steps to.
It was incredibly hard, and I felt scattered at first. Like, wow, what? Yeah, it felt like I didn't really have
Was some of those
an
feelings
anchor.
failure?
Absolutely, yeah. Like, I do feel like I got to a point where I'm like, I think I did everything I could to try to make it work. I really do. And then there's a relief recognizing I can't control this other person. I did what I could. So, but absolutely felt like failure. And I felt really, I was like, oh, I was really dumb. I felt dumb for choosing the kind of person that I did. And for maybe like for being the person that I was for a while too at the beginning of the marriage. Just recognizing, wow, I needed to do a lot of growth. So after the divorce, I feel like that's when all the work really started to happen. And the person I was 5 years ago is so different. And like you were saying, I think my interactions for a while, when I was saying I was kind of in this cocoon phase, some of my family, they were like, "What is going on with you? Like, what is wrong with Victoria?" Or they call me Vicky. And it was hard for them. Like, I would start to assert myself because, again, I was like the golden child, always the goody goody. And I also think my job, a lot of the time, my role in the family was to kind of like keep the peace in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times not speaking up, not sharing how I actually felt. And now I was doing that, trying to assert myself. Maybe wasn't always like I was still practicing
Yeah,
how
it's
to be
messy. Yeah.
assertive. Yeah, it was pretty messy. And I just remember for a while people were like, "What is going on with her?" And that is during that time too is when I like realized, okay, this friendship in particular, like it's only happening, like we're just going through the motions. I'm only maintaining it because we were childhood friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to kind of eliminate, not like go around and
Yeah.
forget everyone.
Yeah.
And, but
You didn't go through the phase, and hopefully maybe you do when you once you have kids. That just automatically happens.
mm-hmm,
Where you're like, hey, my
yeah,
priority is my kids and my husband.
yeah,
And so that just naturally
mm-hmm,
happens once you have kids because you're
yeah,
like, I don't literally have time for anyone else but you.
right,
You haven't had to go through that
mm-hmm,
phase of life, and
yeah,
hopefully you do.
I hope so.
So for a young girl that's listening, right? And it's like, here's what's interesting. The wisdom you have now, it's like, how could I have had that wisdom at a younger age, right? Because
Yeah,
there's things that I've learned now where it's like I don't have regrets from the past, but it's
mm-hmm,
like that knowledge would have been helpful to know in my younger self.
absolutely, yeah.
And so for a young girl now that's listening, what advice would you give to them as far as like, hey, these are things to look for in yourself to know that you're never fully ready.
Mm-mm.
You're never fully ready. Like people, how do you know when you're ready to get married? You're never fully ready.
Right, and I don't think you have to be fully healed to
Yeah.
date either, or to be in a romantic
Yeah.
relationship,
And
because I think that's something else
you're never fully
people see.
ready to have kids.
Hmm.
So there's that, but also there is a point where there should be some self work done in you, and then
Hmm.
also there are some basic expectations you should have um, for your partner that you're
Hmm.
looking at. So
Yeah.
let's go there.
So I would say taking a look, like trying to become more aware of the family dynamics that people grow up in, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So for me to be like, for me, it would have been nicer to be more aware of, okay, yes, my current boyfriend, soon to be fiance then husband, doesn't yell because my dad was so verbally like
Yeah, that was the
aggressive and
only one
vocal.
thing you knew.
So I'm like,
Yeah.
yay, this makes him such a good person because he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't yell. And I didn't really take the time to look at other similarities that I found in him. Like how was I repeating the pattern of my parents, basically, of their relationship? And I said to you earlier, and I really wholeheartedly believe this, I do think everyone could benefit from therapy. I'm not saying everyone needs to go for the rest of their life, it doesn't need to be ongoing, but I think everyone has trauma or things that blind spots, like I was saying earlier, that, it does take someone else outside of a friend or family member to be objective about it and help you figure out what those blind spots are, how are they maybe negatively impacting your life. Having mentors and people that are not afraid to tell you how they really feel. Um, and the thing is, I don't think necessarily that if I had friends or family that said you shouldn't marry this guy, like I don't know if I would listen to them. Again, if my mom and dad said that, I wasn't going to listen to them because I didn't really, especially not my dad, just because I didn't like I recognize that the relationship they had wasn't healthy.
Yeah, you're
So
like
they're
your
speaking
relationship
from their
wasn't
own
great. Yeah.
experience. But again, I did end up repeating that. So I'm glad that what I didn't do is stay in the marriage because that was like divorce in like church is really, it's a bad word,
Yeah.
and I remember for a long time that was one of the reasons I didn't even go there. I didn't even pursue that or even think about that as an option because I was worried about how that people would perceive that, like that's just not allowed. And I remember some people, even after I did uh, get divorced, or like in the process were trying to get me to, just some people actually were trying to be like, no, you need to stay with him. He has he has a drug problem, or however they phrased it, and kind of guilt tripping me to stay. Like I'm not a supportive wife or
Mm-hmm.
person if I don't see him through this. But I was also very pleasantly surprised at how many people were supportive of me making this decision
Mm-hmm.
for myself, just kind of looking at Like they saw the relationship progress over the last however many years. People who I was finally able to be honest about it. Or like you said, you know, I'm sure people knew. People knew something was off, but I was finally talking about it. So I think going back to your original question, having people who you respect and admire, and there's several of those people in my life that I try to keep close, and because I can ask 10 people for 10 different opinions, but I also, you know, they're not always going to be the best opinions. So
Right.
there's who really has like my best interest in mind, who really cares about me and is willing to be honest with me, you know, honest and loving. And I forgot.
How would you know, for a young girl, how would you know you're ready for that next step
For marriage.
to marriage? So you're not going through the motions.
Yeah. Well,
that
now,
traditional girl.
right. Now I know that what I'm looking for is, again, consistency, stability, like integrity. And I recognize how I can play a negative, how I negatively can impact another person. I was able to, because it's easy to just blame the other person. Like in my situation, it's easy to be like, oh, drugs are the problem. But recognizing I also played a negative role in some way. You know, I think, again, I had unrealistic expectations. So looking at our expectations, there's actually a book, and you know what, if young girls are listening, it's called Marry Him, The Case for Mr. Good Enough. A really good book. I read it within the last year, and it was just talking about how, again, women in particular, after doing research, a lot of research, women in particular have really unrealistic expectations and might be like, oh, you know, on my first date, the guy talked with a weird voice. He was trying to make an impression. I'm not going to go on a second date for really superficial things. And then I told you earlier, I was finding reasons to say no. Like, I'm not going to date a therapist because that's too close to my line of work. It's the same thing. I'm not going to date a doctor. They're going to have a God complex. But then really looking at what is it about that that's scaring me? Why am I saying no to some potentially really great people? And that's when I think I realized, oh, because maybe I'm not actually ready to be vulnerable yet with somebody. So I think that's a suggestion I have, is to read that book. And
I'm reading books. It's like if you, as a child, you don't have much knowledge as a young person. So then it's like, well, how do you get knowledge? Through experience or through someone else's experience. So that's how you get knowledge. So how to know what to look for in your spouse. And so one thing I was thinking about was I think there's core things that a child should have growing up. And then it's like, if you realize they missed out on some of those core things, it doesn't mean you can't marry the person. It just means like, oh, this person didn't get this. And so this was just one framework that I saw, but 8 things kids need to thrive: security, stability, consistency, emotional support, love, education, positive role models, and structure. So then it's like, okay, if you're looking at someone to potentially marry, you can look at those 8 things and be like, did this person have this in their life?
Well, that's interesting. The first 3 or 4 you mentioned, those are like what I look for now. And I mentioned that consistency, stability, safety, security.
So then it's like, okay, it doesn't mean you can't marry the person, but have that real life conversation with that person that you're interested in definitely getting married. Like, hey, did you feel love in your home? Like, I was talking to someone that I know close who didn't have love in their home. And then they got married, and then they have struggles with love in their marriage. So it's like, oh, we should look out for that, right? That's where it's like, oh, you probably should go through therapy because you didn't have that in your life, right? So it doesn't mean you can't marry that person. It just means like, hey, they're deficient in these things, and that's something
Or we'll
to look
struggle.
out.
We'll struggle to.
So I didn't have that.
Express
Like,
that.
there's like, I mean, there's way smarter people like Tony Robbins. This is the 100 questions you ask your partner, but just being more deliberate on what you're looking for in a spouse. But just those 8 things right there. Like, if they're deficient, you should be aware of that and then have conversations like, hey, how can we help you become more
like
well-rounded in that?
yeah.
But I did want to also talk about just the concept of the work that you're in. So you're an independent clinical social worker. What did it take to become that? Do you remember?
So, like in terms of schooling, Yeah, so you get your bachelor's degree. I got mine in psychology. And then the master's program was 2 years. And then within those 2 years, you're also doing, like first year, I remember it was a 2-day practicum. Second year was a 3-day practicum. So mine was at the hospital that I work at now. So they just kind of really
Have you ever
immerse you.
desired to like work somewhere else or try something else? You
You
just
know what? I
enjoy
think
going
about
to
it all the time. I'm like, okay, is it that I'm so comfortable with
Mhm.
where I am? It's a good work environment, but a lot of the time it was really stressful. And I still think, and this is something I know about myself now, is that I'm, even if something is really stressful and chaotic, it feels safer than going out into the unknown and experiencing something else because I think, and it's the pessimism in me, and I know I tend to sometimes have a more pessimistic outlook because I think it'll keep me safe. It's like a defense I have, but I just think, oh, well, what if I get another job and it's worse?
Well, on the flip side, like I think culture today, people do switch jobs more
Mm.
often. But as I talk to these people that are in their
Same with
60s and
dating, right?
70s,
Yeah.
they've had their jobs for 30, 40
Mm.
years. So you don't have to switch jobs. I just think it's more common
Yeah.
in today's world than it was. Like most guys I talk to now, I did the same thing for 30 years,
Hmm.
40 years,
Hmm.
50 years.
I mean, it provides some stability just not having to worry about like the
Yeah.
next
So
thing,
there's
right?
nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Just curious if that was something.
Hmm.
So then what else does it take to become a
Oh yes, well to become licensed after, I mean they actually just changed the regulations a little bit. It's easier now, which is actually a good thing. But at the time I needed like several thousand hours of direct experience. I think 3 or 4 thousand hours of direct experience, and then it was so long ago, but I think 160 something hours of individual supervision from a licensed
are they in there
social
with you or
worker.
they're just listening?
No, like I'll see them once a week and I'll tell them, like they'll ask me about my cases at work and then we'll talk about them and they'll basically support me and guide me if I have any questions about my work, um, and just offer support and
Do you do that now with someone else that's in?
mm, yeah, actually a lot of our staff, they're working towards their licensure, so I provide supervision to them.
Nice.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a test you have to take, right?
Yeah, the boards.
Is that a pretty hard test?
It was for me. And
Is that like you're in front of actual people and they're asking you
no,
questions? Or
it's
is it
it's on
multiple?
a
Yeah.
computer.
Okay. It's
Yeah.
not like the bar. I think some of the bar you're actually talking.
No, I think I would have preferred that, honestly.
Mhm.
It was like a 4 hour test, or you have 4.5 hours to take it. And mine, I passed. Fortunately, it tells you right away if you pass or
Mhm.
fail. I passed the first time, fortunately. And I took 7 years. Like you have 7 years to take the boards before it expires, and you can never take it again. And so I waited
You can never
until.
take it again?
No, yeah. I mean, unless they change the rules, but at the time you only had 7 years, a 7 year window to take that exam. And so I remember the Department of Health sending me something in the mail saying you have like 6 months left before, and I'm a total procrastinator. I
Yeah.
do better sometimes under pressure, under stress.
So you can
So,
only take that test once. If you don't get it, you're
well, no, sorry, no, you can take it more than once.
okay.
Although statistically speaking, I think people do worse every time because it
Yeah.
probably, you
Yeah.
get in your head. But within that 7 period time, you have to take the test or you can't get licensed.
Mhm.
So I did that a couple months before it expired for me.
Um, so under the word, I think just Washington State titles it social worker, but it's does therapy, counseling, psychology, do they all fall under that? Is that separate? Like,
They can be used interchangeably. There are different licenses. So LMHC, licensed mental health counselor, um, that's usually what people will get when they think about like, oh yeah, I want to be a counselor, I want to have a private practice. Whereas social work, it focuses more on, so micro being direct practice, social
Mhm.
work also focuses on like the meso and macro, like big picture stuff, changing policies and looking at things from that kind of a lens versus just direct practice. Like how can you affect change from a macro level versus.
So you want to get more into that?
I didn't. I always really liked direct care, but now that in my role at work, I have to pay attention more to the policies. Like the Department of Health shows up a lot, and they look at our processes. Are we doing things the way they need to be done?
Mhm.
Do they meet like the criteria under the Department of Health. So I don't always like it, but I'm definitely learning to
Yeah.
care more about that. And
I think another thing that's interesting to me is just the rise of depression and what's anxiousness? Is that what
anxiety.
anxiety?
Mhm.
What what is anxiety, anxiousness? And
Mhm.
why are we seeing more and more people depressed?
I don't know that it's more and more people. I think, yes, I do think with COVID, like anxiety was at an all-time high, depression at an all-time high because it was just kind of the perfect
Hmm.
situation for that. But I think people have struggled. I think a lot of people have always struggled with anxiety or depression, just weren't talking about it or didn't recognize it for what it was. Um, like anxiety, like I actually didn't know that I had anxiety or was even
So
an
what does that
anxious.
even mean? I hear that term so much. What does anxiety
I
mean?
know it's hard to explain too for me. It's just like not feeling at ease, always like for me it's ruminating, having ruminating thoughts. Like if I had an interaction
Isn't
with
that just being
someone,
human?
there's different levels of it. Like it can get kind of debilitating,
Yeah.
but just ruminating, overthinking things, like mind reading, like hoping, just like cognitive, we talk about cognitive distortions. So mind reading, like, oh, what does this person think about me, um, etc. I think it manifests differently for different people,
So it's a pretty
but
broad term
mhm.
that can mean a lot of different
Yeah, and
things.
like even like when we look at depressive symptoms versus anxiety symptoms, there's a lot of overlap there too.
And
Um,
that's why it's a soft science, because it's like it's at the end of the day it's theory based on a lot of, I don't know if you use the word evidence, but just based on a lot of
yeah, I think we could say
uh,
evidence.
but again it's a theory, so it's like 1 + 1 is a fact, or 1 + 1 = 2 is a
Mhm.
fact, where hey, you have these symptoms, we diagnose you with this, but
It's like you were saying, more invisible.
yeah, and you can get past that. Like you can change. They're saying though, I think we mentioned narcissism. They're saying people can't change from that, but
I
it's
don't know that
like
I believe that. I think it's hard. Well, with like sociopathy, like can sociopaths change? I think that's what they say too. I don't know. It wouldn't give me a lot of hope to
right.
hear that I'm never going to be able to change if I have like narcissistic personality disorder, you
But
know?
so I've been learning more about that as well, and I think it's a spectrum as well,
Hmm.
right? Because it's like, okay, is every CEO narcissist? Right? A lot of them are, but also a lot of them know how to control that,
Hmm.
I think, right? Because we love to use that term now,
Right.
right? But then it's just like, just because someone's self-driven, because
Hmm.
someone is whatever, like you do have to have some level of some delusion to think that you can go start something from
Hmm.
scratch and make something successful. So I don't know if what is maybe, I don't know the answer to this. So what is another term, what's another word you could use other than narcissism for someone that has the good traits, and if you can say
I mean,
good
I
traits.
think we all have narcissistic traits, right? Like
That's
you're
what I'm
saying,
saying.
it's a
Yeah.
spectrum.
Yeah.
Um, it's just like how much of it impacts your life and your relationships with
So
other
the way
people.
I understand narcissism is using other people to get what you want.
Yeah, I think that's one aspect of it. But yeah, at the expense of others, you
Yeah.
don't really have a regard for other people at the
Um,
end of the day if it benefits you.
but you do have to have some level of so there's another guy, like, listen to PBD, Patrick Bet David. So when he's looking for like the C suite,
Mm-hmm.
he's like, you have to have some, like, 0 is you don't care about yourself at all. It's all about other people.
Mm-hmm.
And then 100 is all you do is care about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, I want somebody at 70
Right.
where they can make the decisions that may hurt other people, but it's for the good of
Like
the
the mission
company
and the
or the
goal.
mission or whatever. So he's like, you have to have some level of it. So where does that? So that I think about that as like, because we just start labeling them as narcissists, and it's like, dude,
Mm-hmm.
everyone has. You have to have. You have to
Yeah, it's like
believe
an
in.
easy,
You have
it's
to
an
like
easy,
yourself at
right.
some level,
Of
right? That
course,
doesn't make you
yeah,
a bad
yeah.
person to like.
And I think when we call it like, oh, I dated a narcissist or I dated a bunch of narcissists, a lot of times it's like, okay, what is that saying about me then, right?
Right.
Why do I keep picking people
Yeah.
that fit into that so-called category? Um,
Because
I
that's like
mean,
a newer science, isn't it? the term narcissism?
No, I just think it's more popular now.
I know it's been around for like 10 years, but they're really like, they like
Yeah, it's
harping on
all
that
right.
term a
It's all
lot.
over like social media. People are definitely misusing and mislabeling
But
that term. But
so, what's the question I didn't ask in regards to your profession or where you are in life today? Do you feel hopeful about the future? Are you excited?
I do feel very hopeful, and um, I was talking to someone who, at such a young age, is already like, oh, the good old days are behind me, you know. And for me, I look back like, would I want to be, do I want to be 10 years younger? No, I really enjoy where I am right now in life, and I've learned so much. So, like you were saying earlier, sometimes like we gain wisdom. Unfortunately, we have to wait and just kind of get through life, right? I wish I knew what I do now 10 years ago. That would have benefited me.
Mhm.
But I also think it's because of those experiences that I was able to kind of gain that kind of insight or awareness. And I just, yeah, I feel like if I look at my life 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it's only improved.
Mhm.
And I like the person that I am today. Can't say that I liked who I was 10 years ago. I think I was much more judgmental, and it stemmed from me projecting my own insecurities onto other people. But I think I'm much more of an authentic person.
So, there was a survey done, and they asked people from all age groups what was their favorite time of life. Do you know what the age that was?
I would like to say that it's now, like that I'm living it
It's
now.
35.
Yeah. Well, I'm 33.
Yeah. But
Oh, that's what it is
it's
for the, oh,
35.
okay.
So, like, because they would ask people, like, who are 40, 50, 60, 20, 30,
Hmm.
or I guess you have to be older than 35, but 35 was the common number because that was the point in life where you've been an adult long enough
Yeah.
where hopefully you're not that same person when you're
Hmm.
20. And then after 35, it's not that life gets worse necessarily, but physically, if you don't take care of your body,
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Definitely
have limiting
noticing that.
you have limiting issues. But 35 was that number. So I'm 35,
Yeah.
so this is the best year of my life.
Yeah.
But 35 is when you've gained enough wisdom,
Mhm.
hopefully, and you still physically can do stuff. And then
Yeah. Yeah.
again, you
That
can
makes
delay
sense.
the onsets of the physical side,
Hmm.
but if you put effort into it. But is there anything I missed that you think would be important to share in regards to your life or just the topic of social work or therapy?
Well, I think that we talked about like the misconception of, I think people think, oh, social worker must be very like caring charity worker, right?
Mhm.
And so I think just recognizing that it's beyond that, there's so much more to social work. And I feel like I shared quite a
You
bit. I
did.
mean, I could go on and on about, like, I can talk a lot. Um,
So in a session, for someone that's never been to therapy, we'll end on this. What is like for someone that's I would never do that, or I'm scared,
mm.
or what's it like? I'm the patient. Let's go. We'll do a 2 minute session.
Oh my gosh, this makes me nervous.
Fix my whole life,
No
all my
way.
problems. What's a common issue a man my age would have? And we'll go from there.
Let's see. You know what? Here's what I will say really quick. Instead of doing a therapy session, because I'm getting nervous, we are getting more males now than ever in our therapy groups. At one point, we had an all male group, and we have 9 different groups, like simultaneous groups, therapy groups going on. We have an all female group and had an accidental all male group. And it was so incredible, like brought me to tears, honestly. I wasn't the therapist, I was off screen. And I say off screen because we do a lot of our groups virtually right now. But to see men being vulnerable, and I think, like you were saying earlier, they need other men in their lives, like people that they can trust and be vulnerable with, which I know like society doesn't really allow for men to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
They're always supposed to be really strong, even though being vulnerable absolutely is being strong.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just really cool to see males going to therapy and supporting themselves in this way that 10 years ago they probably wouldn't have.
I think one of the reasons I was more hesitant on this line of work 10 years ago was so you think back 100, 150 years ago, people didn't have this,
Hmm.
right? And part of it was because back then in society, we spent 98% of our energy on food and shelter.
Yeah.
So you didn't have time to sit there and
Mm-mm.
think about your feelings.
Right. You're in survival mode, right?
Yeah. And the other thing is most people died by the time they're 40.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're living longer. And so the traumatic, because I would say everyone probably had a traumatic
Absolutely, yeah,
childhood,
everyone.
right?
Or it had like a
Especially
traumatic
back then,
event.
like
Yeah.
death was very common.
Mhm.
Violence is very common. So you're like, how did these people make it? And I think that was probably one of my things is that's just life. But now that we don't have to spend all of our energy on surviving, now we are able to like think about the fact that we can sit here and think about life.
Mm-hmm.
That's crazy. We're like 150 years ago is thinking about farming.
Like basic needs, yeah.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
the
So
Maslow's triangle.
I think that's probably why I was more hesitant about it before, because it was just
Mhm.
like, what, they didn't do this 150 years ago, 200 years ago,
Yeah.
plus, thousands of years before
They
that.
didn't do a lot of things too.
Because for me, it was just like the thought of thinking about life.
Mm-hmm.
You just did life.
Yeah.
But now we live in a time where we spend very little energy on food and shelter.
Yeah.
But so now we have the luxury of actually sitting
Right.
there and thinking through all these things.
And I will say therapy absolutely is like, we call it treatment, but it is very healing. It is medicine. And I hope like more people continue to like learn about it and get more comfortable with it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
It was a lot of
Josiah. It was
fun.
nice to see you after not seeing you for
Yeah.